Welcome back, everyone, to the Debrief stream with Daniel of Platypus and myself to talk about the chat we had with Warren Mosler on Saturday. Because by judging by some of the feedback, a lot was kind of not quite understood, and I think a lot was left unsaid. And I think there's a lot more to unpack from that discussion and about Marxism and MMT in general. So why don't we start by having Daniel? Why don't you just tell us your overall general impressions of how that conversation went? To me,
Yes.
yeah, go for it.
Oh no. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invite as well, and definitely credit for Eamon both not only setting this up, but like when you had reached out and said, "Oh, do you want to speak to Warren Mosler?" I think I mentioned this on the stream. I was like, "Oh, I used to read him like a decade ago."
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it was a kind of like, just a privilege to be able to talk to someone like that. He's very nice guy. There was like a lot of chummy moments. Um, I think my thoughts kind of so let's see what maybe surprised me. Maybe not that much because some of it was I'm just familiar with. In other words, I have read several of his texts and his articles. I think some of them came up. Um, there were also moments where maybe he said something that I'm aware I was kind of thinking about it this week, where someone says something and maybe in the moment they kind of said it, and maybe if they were to think about it for a few minutes, they go, well, I don't completely think of that, but like, there's something about having a discussion where also if the discussion turns to a not that there was a hostile tone, but like an argumentative tone, like a questioning tone, an
Yeah.
interrogative tone, that somebody might say things in ways that are like, yeah, like, it enters a kind of wordplay where it's maybe a little bit polemical or less than polemical, but in that range. And so I think for me, I guess when towards the end I kind of asked him about like, oh, does might make right? Like, and again, where you're asking it in a kind of interrogative sense, not in a like polemical sense. And I think he might have said something like, yeah, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't like I why the reason I'm mentioning something like that is because I'm trying to say I think it's one of these things that maybe somebody says, and also if maybe they were to think about it, might go, well, I don't totally mean that. What I mean is this or that, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe this has been the case, or it's something like that. Um, and so the reason I bring that up is that actually was the most surprising thing to me. If he's like, yes, I literally think that, like, would commit to such a thing like that. I don't think he does actually think that. And on what basis might I think that? Well, he called Donald Trump a fascist. So certainly, if you think
Mm.
somebody's a fascist, then might makes right doesn't actually quite gripe with that because you're basically characterizing someone as violating rights of
Right.
some sorts or violating some order. It's a fascist. They're insurrectionary. They're destroying something. Again, it's like one of these things that I know a back and forth. If you were to hold me to every single word that I said, then maybe I would, go, oh, yeah, maybe I said that, but I kind of more meant that. So otherwise, those were kind of my thoughts. And then, I think my points of the feedback I've seen, I think people picked up on them, but maybe not. In other words, I think people picked up on the questioning about, the scorekeeper.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like in other words, in the American Revolution, wasn't that a classic example of the players on the field saying, "Oh, we don't want this scorekeeper anymore."
Mm-hmm.
Right? In other words, actually, we're not even going to accept the points as meaningful points. And maybe to reverse a phrase that Warren likes to say of how does litter become money, the money went back to being litter. So, anyways, those were kind of my thoughts. Otherwise, it was very nice. Very, very friendly. I read some of the comments, some of them were cool. Some of them were like, Daniel's an idiot. That's fine. Of course, anybody can read anything on YouTube. But yeah, those were kind of my thoughts.
Yeah. Let's pick up on the scorekeeper theme here. What what does it mean for a theory like modern monetary theory, for for this point you're bringing up about what if the baseball players want to decide the rules themselves, or like in relation to like MMT versus you know, in their world, he's in Mosler's world, he's basically trying to set things right in his mind, like get a proper understanding of how money works versus like he's fighting against the Keynesians, he's fighting against the Austrians, the neoclassicals, all these other kind of and the basically the orthodoxy in economics departments right now. So what is it something that he's missing specifically, or maybe that whole debate between all these schools are not getting with regard?
Yeah, so no, that's a very good question. So a simple answer would be that uh, the problem is not whether or not the scorekeeper is going to run out of points. In other words, I get that point. It's why I never brought up the budget deficit ever. In other words, the points scored by MMT against, I'm just going to say like hard money advocates. This came up when we were talking about the Austrians as well.
Yeah.
Of course that makes sense. Of course it makes sense that if we're running a poker game, I can't run out of points. And, I remember many years ago, this is probably when Alan Greenspan was like in the public. So it's right after he was Fed chair. It's when Bernanke was Fed chair. He just went on like CNBC and said something like, well, the Fed could print a $1 trillion coin, right? Meaning the US government's not going to run out of money. They could just print it and then pay for whatever budget deficit we have. So in terms of the purpose of that analogy from Warren, I think it is accurate maybe in a more narrow sense that it's after. The issues start to be like, I guess I was there to be like, the Marxist who didn't say anything Marxist, basically, is that then how does one make sense of this in relationship to society and history, right? So I'll start saying Marxist stuff. I'll quote Lenin. Every analogy is lame, right? He says that in 1922. So, it's just like the George Box thing that every model is wrong, but some are more useful than others. Meaning what I was trying to kind of put my finger on was not so much does it play the role of shooting down this fallacy about the government as a household budget, so much as then when people extrapolate it to explaining like society itself. And so that's why I was kind of getting at, can MMT give an account of itself? So now
I don't think it can.
Yeah.
I think it just attempts to explain macroeconomics as it stands today. Like he said his starting point is somewhere in the 70s, right? And basically he doesn't look at what brought about it.
Right. So, okay, again, this is a great point, even. In other words, that's fine for plenty of things. The question is, when do you get to the point where you have to give an account of yourself? Meaning, anytime you read an economics paper out of the NBER, it's not like the paper says, do we live in capitalist society? They just start. They go, okay, yeah, we have like, a continuous distribution of agents who are like infinitely lived, and they just start going into these models and stuff like that. And that's fine. So in a lot of ways, there's nothing even wrong about MMT per se. It depends on what is the object that we're talking about. If you're simply trying to say operationally, because I saw this as the term in the comments, people love to say the term operational. Oh, I'm just being operational. About how the monetary system works in terms of you're not literally going into a vault, picking up gold and putting it in another bank, but literally just pressing, putting numbers from one account into another, then yes, you can't run out of those numbers. And yes, in that sense, maybe the rhetoric of, I don't know, the committee on the budget on like Capitol Hill, maybe they use all sorts of concepts and framing of budget debates that is not helpful, not useful, riven with fallacies and confusing. So what then I was trying to get at is that, well, I know there are leftists who are interested in MMT, right? Meaning I don't have a criticism of like Warren. Like Warren, I don't know what Warren's political beliefs are. That's fine. One can have whatever they have. I know that this is like, it's the Swoletariat podcast.
Yeah.
It's a reference to proletariat. You have dialectical materialism is in the comments. It's a Marxist podcast. And so ostensibly we're interested in society, socialism. And bound up with that is an idea of transforming society, of unmet potential. And so where I was trying to go with that question was to say, okay, there are leftists who are interested in MMT, but how do they run up against their commitments to society?
Hmm.
And so then the question starts to be, where does society figure in that analogy? And I think the potential problem with how MMT presents things, it depends. I don't really know. And of course, it's hard to say MMT in general because I know there are people who debate within MMT and are in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, is that it starts to seem like the state basically constitutes society, or actually, let me take that back, even just is the cause of society altogether,
Right.
right?
Yes. Leftists. A
So
lot of leftists think that. Yeah.
a lot of leftists have a Carl Schmittian view of basically politics, of basically it's like the primacy of the political form society. Even Thomas Hobbes doesn't think that. So Hobbes is kind of one side of Rousseau's dialectic of society, that we came out of the state of nature. And so the reason I bring this up then in terms of the analogy is I was trying to get at kind of the limits of it. And that's when it started to be, and I think Warren actually said, oh, yeah, well, what happened in 1776 is we overthrew or he said something like the scorekeeper is just a function, and we changed the scorekeeper and we changed the rules in the law. And so I say that because if you give the example of saying, how does the economy basically begin? The modern economy by saying it starts with taxation is creating the liability that therefore people have to work and, in response to, literally it's like taxes creates unemployment. And then people have to work goods and services in order to meet that liability. So let me frame it in a different way. Here, I'll turn it back. What's already there in chapter 4 of volume 1 of Capital? MCM, right? Meaning in capitalism, it seems like the world begins with the advance, that everything starts with the advance sets everything in motion, and inevitably the advance comes back. It's called, the way that Thomas Took puts it is the law of reflux. And I know actually this kind of touches on some of what MMT is interested in because L. Randall Wray, in his 1990 dissertation, wrote about the banking school, like Thomas Took, who basically had a criticism of the currency school. These are the bullionists. These are the people who basically say money is set, they have like a quantity theory of money. This was something that came up, like how much money is in the economy is setting prices.
Yeah.
So the banking school, which criticized it, basically said, well, no, actually, there seems to be a pretty significant discrepancy between the gold in the like reserves of the banks and the actual coin that was fluctuating around the economy. And they basically had an idea that credit was what was determining money, right? Which is a lot more. The banking school is not MMT, but it rhymes, right? They have a similar kind of idea. It's not the same thing, of course not. If somebody in the chat is like, no, it's not, blah, 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 that they're not scoring any points here, but it rhymes. And I know that it rhymes because, again, L. Randall Wray goes, yeah, it does kind of rhyme. They have the insight into endogenous money and the law of reflux and these kinds of things like this. And of course, Alfred Innes Mitchell, he has a credit theory of money. I know he's talking about ancient society and debts and obligations, but he basically makes the point, he believes he's making the point, counter Adam Smith, that really money begins with like credit. It's beginning with like an advance. And so coming back to this, I feel like when I read the standard accounts of MMT, whether it's in Warren's papers, it's in, what's her name, Pavlina Trinata. I'm fucking up
don't
her
know.
last name. Okay, Pavlina, I'm just going to say her, very, very nice lady who writes on full employment. Forstrader, Stephanie Kellen, just MMT school, Randall Wray, Bill Mitchell. Again, they'll say when they're setting things up, okay, it begins with taxes creates unemployment. it's the tax-driven view of money. I think Stephanie has a cute way of putting it. She calls it like the stabs view. No, it's the tabs view as opposed to the stabs view in her book, The Deficit Myth. And so for me, what I was trying to touch on is like the analogy I feel like it's kind of starting in the middle of the story. And so
Right.
even if somebody was to say this is just descriptive,
Yeah.
the question is, what is the limits of simply saying, I'm just describing the world as it is when we're talking about society? Everything in society has become. And we got at this at the end a little bit, but maybe not really, which is that for me, the fact that the Federal Reserve has a total monopoly, not, excuse me, the US government has a total monopoly on the US dollar, it's the monopoly currency issuer, all of these things. To me, my immediate question is, how did it become so? And I don't think actually that content, how it became so, can be truly separated from describing simply what is. I know that might ring as like odd to people, but this is the standard problem with positivism, is that it kind of treats the immediate product, right? The finished product as the thing. Or here, I'll start putting it in Marxist language. There's an identity of thought and being, just straightforward. Oh, this is what I see. This is what it is.
Right. So
Go ahead.
it's taken as naturalized and kind of fixed almost through time and space.
It need not be naturalized because I think at one time Warren said, okay, maybe that was the case, but this is now.
Yeah, he said it. He said
Yeah,
it's context dependent, and this is the context.
right. And I'm still trying to say, but maybe to say what is, you have to say how it became, right? And what's implied by that. Meaning, I'll give
So
you
what would Warren discover if he looked into how it became? What would
here,
change?
I'll give you two different pathways. So one pathway is the economy basically, I don't know, the US, the state is basically the cause of the economy, right? It creates the tax liability and puts everything together. In which case, yeah, anything that happened in 1848, anything that happened in 1828, anything that happened in 1789, anything else, it is indifferent. It is like total postmodern historicism. This just fell into this. Okay, wait, but let me change it a little bit. Let's open up the story a little bit. I'm going to start using the Marxist language. Let's say there was a bourgeois revolution. Let's say it did go into crisis. Let's say that crisis led to the recrudescence of the state, right? The state kind of returns in a different way. And by the way, when does the French state get monopoly control over the issuance of money? March 1848. Yeah, not a surprise.
So
And
yeah,
by the way,
okay. After
when does this happen in Germany, by the way? Under Bismarck. Not a surprise, right? In other words, the content of the institutions then changes. Because then rather than it being this story where the world begins with the taxes, like in other words, if I was in a polemical mood, I would be like, this is like from the Bible. Like God said, and then the world began, right? It's like God said, tax these poor plebes, and so the world begins. And what I'm trying to say is like, obviously, all of these state institutions are Bonapartism.
yep.
And if they're Bonapartism,
So that's
then,
what I said at the very beginning.
right. Yeah,
I said it
right.
feels like a theory of Bonapartism.
But if you just say that to people who don't know what you're talking about, they're like, I don't know what that means, right? Like if I just start saying Bonapartism to people, people are like, what do you mean Napoleon Bonaparte? What the hell are you talking about?
I did sort of clarify what I
Yeah.
meant by that at the
No,
time,
no,
but yeah,
I'm not, this is not it's not a personal criticism. It's like, this is why what people want is they want like Marxist economics and MMT. And I
yeah,
know you've had these debates like this. And to me, there's not Marxist economics. There was the critique of political economy.
yeah,
And with the critique of political economy, it really was bound up with the way in which the contradiction of society was embodied in a political movement, such that the critique could translate into practice. It actually wasn't me convincing you. It was actually a political subject kind of gaining consciousness of itself, which actually meant organization. You know all of this. You have a Trotskyist background, gaining
Yeah.
organization of itself. So if one was to do the same thing with like Keynesianism, well, in a sense, there's no political movement really bound up with it.
No.
So it's really just people debating. And also, when you see Marxists, like, I hate to bring this up, please don't get mad at me, anybody. I don't know. Ted Reese had a debate on your podcast with Sam.
Did you watch it?
Yes, yes. And, very nice. Everybody's nice on there. This is not a personal thing. But it is not the route I would go if I was representing the Marxists, where it would be like, I'm just going to start saying falling rate of profit in organic composition, right? Which, of course, even falling rate of profit was Marx giving an imminent critique of political economy, for which the falling rate of profit was an expression of the freedom of society. So, as he puts it in a letter to Engels, he's overthrowing political economy because he's demonstrating the inversion of means and ends. So if you just like say it today, it's like, I don't know what we're talking about. It's just like you're interested in a leading economic indicator maybe or something like that, or it's the earnings. It's just like a thing. And of course, people can brush it aside because it just seems. So again, to me, the appropriate way always to talk to people is trying to really understand where they're coming from, trying to like learn even in that sense, even if you're supposed to be debating with them. So in the context, then again, back to the MMT, it's like, what if this is, it's not a question about, to me, does this make sense to people? Is it rational? But what are the conditions of possibility of it even making this kind of sense? We also got at this at the end.
Yep.
When we were saying like, well, could MMT, you asked this question, could it have existed like 200 years ago?
Yeah. Okay. That was the part I was going to bring up
Yeah.
that I was most surprised about the whole debate. That Warren said, sure, yeah, we could have MMT in 200 years ago in Britain or America.
10,000 years ago. Yeah, right. In other words, all it is simply a game, right? It, like you basically asked, could we have played poker in this, Stone Ages? Could we have played poker in medieval France or something? And so what I'm trying to say is, no, there's a reason MMT finds purchase, right? And that it has the plausibility. I mean, again, back to the banking school, Marx kind of makes this, antinomy between the currency school and the banking school. So that the banking school are saying, look, money is beginning with the extension of credit, and the currency school is saying, no, it's like the value of the currency. He's trying to say, and people hate this, I'm sorry, everybody, but he's trying to say they're kind of both right. Right? Maybe, I don't know if it helps for me to go into that, or we can come back to that, or if you had other thoughts on that of where that's coming from.
Go into that a bit more.
Let me, how about I go into value?
Yeah.
How about that? Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is the tricky thing. So when I would read the MMT people, they would say, okay, Adam Smith created this crazy like myth that barter leads to like money or something like that. So one, that's just not true. If you just read The Wealth of Nations, you just open the book, like the scene out of The Cable Guy when the electricity goes out and Kyle Gass turns and, oh my God, a book, let me read a book. Which is that if you just read Wealth of Nations, Smith in the very first chapters is saying, well, look, money has been like the, like the realm of the seigniorage of the prince or the authority, that they have like coined it. They've done all these things. They've messed with the money. And it's part of him making an argument where he says something like, labor has been the most constant measure of value in human history. Okay, what is the point of this argument? So he's not saying barter leads to money. He's saying money has come to represent labor. That was not always the case in human history.
Right.
Right? In fact, for most of human history, that was not the case. Now, I know that the word labor for people, that's like in the Bible. So how is that not the case? That, even the divine word itself says this has always been there since we've been out of the Garden of Eden, or if not then, at least after the flood. So work has always existed. People have always worked. Animals work. Non-sentient beings work. They literally process their mechanisms and things like that. What's happening with Adam Smith is he's saying, look, there has been a kind of revolution in humanity that's kind of crept up over centuries and centuries and centuries, kind of slowly. If you take a place like France, maybe it happened over 1400 years. This is what they used to say around the French Revolution, where what was happening in the cities was that people were reorganizing, like they kind of spontaneously fell into it, their entire like being in a way that was qualitatively different than what we could call ancient society. Usually, if you were a worker in ancient society, it meant you were conquered, right? If you really want to follow through on the MMT story of taxation creates unemployment, there wasn't really unemployment prior to bourgeois society. In fact,
No.
if you were unemployed, they might just kill you. They used to have these laws where it's like if you were a vagrant, you were either killed or you were thrown on a parish or something. Like, the church would take care of you.
Yeah.
But there wasn't unemployment. There wasn't unemployment because for most of human history, you didn't have a right to take your labor as your property and go and sell it to different people.
There also just wasn't much of a market. Well,
There,
yeah, I mean, in some places there were.
there was like Ben Studebaker likes to bring up to me that there was like wage labor and money and all these things, and I go, there was, and yet that's not what we're talking about in bourgeois society. Meaning only certain classes of people could even wage labor. And in fact, if you consider one of the reasons for the decline of Rome, it's that you had free people who weren't allowed to do the vocations of slaves, right? And so there's a weird way that they were like looking for a means to like pay their taxes or even just live. Some of them just went and joined the German barbarians because their place in society was kind of carried on by the slaves. I think Warren even brought up I don't remember if he brought up Rome or Britain, but I know in something he's written he brought up like Rome. He did bring up Rome. He brought up the
Yeah.
Gauls. Okay. So again, the Romans go and conquer the Gauls, and let's say they subject them to some kind of tribute. So in a lot of cases, they had to do in kind because, okay, you just conquered a bunch of German barbarians. They don't have, am I allowed to curse? Or is that bad
Go
on
for
your
it.
stream? They didn't have a fucking monetary economy. They're Gauls, right? They're like peoplets. Like, go watch the beginning of Gladiator, right? Like, this is what we're talking about. And they're like cool. They become cool like after the decline of Rome. It's like Clovis and stuff, and they're badass warriors. But like literally, Rome seeking monetary payment. One of the only things that the Gauls could do is they could go and join the Roman military, meaning one of the only paid occupations, like where you would get money, was being in the Roman like legion.
Yeah.
I forget the exact Latin for this. It's like the solidad. It's the coin for the soldier. So if you're going to pay the taxation, you basically had to be in the military because people did not like merchants. By the way, I don't know if you know about this. There were a lot of pogroms, right? That it was just like, oh, the merchants would show up in town and they would sell all these goods and they would fuck up everything. Right? So people couldn't really experience mercantile activity in the same way. It's why Aristotle looks down upon it, right? It's speculation and things like this. Artisanship was looked down upon. So, you can read someone like, off the top of my head, I think it's Seneca, but you can definitely find this there with like Aristotle, who they would say, oh, art is beautiful, but the artist is like ugly because they're an artisan. They do things with their hands. So why am I saying all this? To work was a mark of slavery. That's one thing. And two, you really couldn't have, like, only in the most banal, abstract way could you say this was possible 2,000 years ago. And when I say banal and abstract, I mean abstracting from everything that existed on Earth. Like, only saying in the most, if that's the case, I could say, fucking Donald Trump could have existed 4,000 years ago. Like, yeah, in the most abstract way, I could literally put somebody in a time machine and put them backwards. But we're talking about actual historical concrete reality. that yes, it couldn't exist. And not only that, Rome had a lot of problems with trying to introduce money into the taxation streams that it led to starvation and scarcity because you were putting it on farmers who, like, you're putting it on peasants who didn't trade. And so consequently, you were thrusting upon them a whole way of life that they couldn't actually deal with. Similar thing happens under Louis XIV. And Bois Guilbert writes about it. He says, money makes war on people. Okay, so why am I saying this? Because what plays out then in the cities after the collapse of Rome is literally what, someone like Augustin Thierry would later call the municipal revolution. But since he was French, it was the bourgeois revolution. This is where we get this phrase from. It's the burghers in town. And because you basically had runaway slaves and serfs in town, and when I say like a revolution, I mean, this happened over centuries that people completely reorganized humanity on the basis of exchanging their labor. So their work, right? Meaning work gained a social value in a way that was not the case in ancient society. And so let's dig into that because it's easy to say has a social value, but we really need to get at it. When Adam Smith says something like, labor is the basis of value, his concern is not price. This is what I keep seeing in the comments and the chats. People talk about like the labor theory of value, and then they start talking about prices. Prices already presuppose many things before you can even get to that. What Adam Smith is talking about is because what has literally happened in the cities is such a qualitative transformation and revolution in the cosmos of humanity that people are now so fully formed by society that their very capacities have become an object to society, qua society, to literally the world that they live in. So I'll put it like this, maybe provocatively. There's always been trade. There's always been prices, there's always been money, there's always been commodities, there's always been profit, there's always been the falling rate of profit if there's always been profit. There's always been wage labor, okay? Okay, Studebaker, yes. There hasn't always been the exchange of labor because you didn't always have people constituted by a society based on labor exchanging. So that when you had trade in pre-bourgeois society, to quote Marx, it was basically accidental. It was like merchants would meet, assuming they didn't chop each other's fucking head off, they would exchange. And on what basis were those like prices judged? Judged. How about that? Before I even say measured, judged. Like to say, is this a good price or fair price? I don't know if you ever traded like fucking N64 games with your friends when you were kids or something, or baseball cards or something.
Yeah. Hockey
It's
cards,
just,
N64 games for sure.
there you go. Just totally based on like what happened right there. It was an accident, right? There was kind of nothing more except for the parties involved that was there. Over centuries and centuries, like, this is why I was surprised to kind of hear that the entire like Arab trade was just like dismissed. And even like, Columbus and the Silk Road and like all of these things were just kind of like, oh yeah, there was like no trade. Like I kept talking about between sovereigns and between communities, right? The kind of German distinction of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Bourgeois society, it really springs up in the interstices between communities. Like you have these towns, but in a sense, these towns could only ever have developed into something that is larger than themselves because they were also expanding. Like, we could say there maybe were plenty of times where there were towns that might have been bourgeois society in the embryo and was just killed. Like frickin' lords just invaded, chopped everybody's head off, burned it down, the end. Nothing goes there. So over time, what's happening, you're having merchants, you're having slaves and serfs that have run away into the cities, and you have guilds. So you have the resurrection of artisanship, is you're basically having the large-scale cooperation between different sovereigns on the basis of these kinds of relationships. So I think, by the way, Warren said this, and it's a very common, what I think is a mistake. So it's not specific to him. It's a very common view today. He said societies, like plural.
Right.
On the one hand, that's like right in the colloquial usage, meaning people say American society, Chinese society, Russian society, or something like that. On the other hand, no, there's one society, right? Meaning one has to explain the commensurability, the interchange, the inter-exchange between all of these different places.
Right.
Or as Spencer Leonard
Which
just
would be
put it on,
impossible if we were truly different societies.
if we were truly different. Right. Because by the way, what does society mean to the bourgeoisie? It means like what separates us from nature. That's what it means. We're not talking about like, I know, Eamon, you're in Canada, I'm in the US. We're not talking like different nations. By the way, nations didn't mean shit to the bourgeoisie. They were like, whatever. It's like, these are kind of archaic things,
Yeah.
right? We're not talking about different cultures, which also exist within countries, right? Like in Canada, there are different cultures and things like that. Okay. No, we're talking about like, for Rousseau, the difference between society and non-society is humans and like nature, right? Like literally when we were Homo sapiens. So the term society and human, and let me pick up another thing that was in the comments, freedom. That's what's distinguishing things. Meaning society is the ground of freedom. That's why we're free. That's why we're not slaves to our instincts. And number two, society is really bound up with what it means in terms of being therefore human, right? That humans are amphibious. We're kind of spiritual and also physical. Because I think someone raised this question about like freedom versus justice.
Yeah, okay, I was going to bring up, that was the comment I was going to bring up. He called you a libertarian socialist as opposed, a libertarian Marxist as opposed to a normal Marxist or normal socialist. Like you had some special concern with freedom, as if Marxists shouldn't. And that what really we need to be concerned with is justice above all as socialists.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, my simple response is, I guess that's just the old bad antinomy between collectivism and individualism, which is a total regression from the 18th century. Like total regression, meaning individuals are social beings, and therefore the defense of one individual against everybody else in the world is the defense of society. And I think that's why I even brought up in the chat, I said, well, if I go to China, aren't my civil rights protected? In which case Warren said, well, no, they just executed somebody for like drugs or something. And I'm like, wait, that's a political right. The point is, if I go to China, I'm not in a state of nature where if I get attacked, it's neither right nor wrong.
Can you flesh out this idea here, like political rights versus the rights you're talking about?
Yes. If I go to China, I can't participate in elections. I can't, I'm not in a political party. Again, something like execution, that's like a law, right? I mean, when I used to live down in Houston, Texas, people like myself used to protest the execution of death row inmates. Right? It's a political aspect in that sense. And by the way, ostensibly what happens when you are in jail is that you have forfeited your rights because you have broken the rights. In other words, you've sent yourself to jail, just to go back to this point about the individual and collective. Meaning, I think another thing that got kind of confused was the difference between rights and duties and privileges. Meaning rights are things that we have duties to all of us for. And that naturally emerged, just to go back to the story of bourgeois society, it emerged out of practice. So again, the questions I was asking, I think it was the first question I asked Warren, do the players have rights against the scorekeepers?
He was confused by that.
I know it would be, because it's the way in which the analogy kind of breaks and no longer makes contact with reality, which is that on the one hand, yeah, that would seem weird if I was to say, do the baseball players have rights against the scorekeeper? That makes no fucking sense. But if you're going to analogize that for how the world works, well, then all of a sudden it's very different. Right? In other words, do people have rights against the state? Yes, of course. And actually, not only do they have rights against the state, but the authority of the state is emerging out of the degree to which it even upholds the rights, that it's representative.
Hmm.
These were things that were already like people talked about like 300 years ago. In other words, they were like, well, might doesn't make right because if even you're definitely stronger than me, if you were to like conquer me or something, you didn't create a right, you simply are restraining somebody physically.
Right.
But rights, on the other hand, are these, it's a question of social practice. It's objective. It's
Hmm.
not a subjective opinion. It couldn't be a right if it was subjective
Hmm.
because it has to be like recognized by all parties for it to even be a right and therefore a duty and something one can claim. But what I was trying to say is that, yeah, this is where the analogy kind of breaks down because if I go to a baseball game, even me entering into a baseball stadium is already presupposing all these rights. Like I'm taking myself, I have bodily autonomy to go and exchange, to get entrance into somebody else's property to then therefore participate in the terms of the contract. Like
Pol-
if I went to, go
these are
ahead.
political rights or civil rights, or
These are civil
yeah.
rights. These are civil rights, right? In other words, we're not talking about the realm of coercion. We're talking about the realm of voluntary exchange, civil rights.
So I think he asked how can you enforce rights without coercion?
Right. Okay. So by reason,
Ah,
like in other words, I mean, here's a very simple thing. Is the only reason people don't get murdered today because they're afraid of the police shooting them?
some people think so.
I think that's, can I say this on your stream? Retarded.
Okay.
Like in other words, no, it actually just simply is the case. It was a good point that Spencer Leonard once made to me where he even took like imagine the worst serial killer in the world. I don't know. It's like, most of their life they're actually following the law and they're following, they're respecting other people's rights. Like you just take some crazy, like, Ted Bundy, like, kind of person. It's like, yeah, most of the other time he's like respectful. He's even following the mores and customs of things. So yeah, no, I would go out on a limb and say, yeah, the reason, by the way, people who murder other people know it's wrong
Hmm.
also, right? Which is why when somebody murders somebody, they're like, yeah, I didn't do it, or it was out of self-defense, or I'm insane.
Hmm.
I don't know, the Luigi Mangione thing, is he like, yeah, I murdered that person? No, he's like, no, this person has been terrorizing. I'm actually doing something I'm in defense of society, right? I don't know if they're going to do the insane thing or something like that. Prior to bourgeois society, conquering somebody was good. It meant you were a strong, badass motherfucker,
Hmm.
right? It's even in Star Trek, it's the Klingons.
Yeah.
So the Klingons are like, when we die, we're going to go to, another world where we're going to keep fighting because fighting is good.
Hmm.
Okay, so coming back to the analogy for me, it's like, yeah, I feel like it breaks down because while it might touch on the point, it might be fair to talk about how the government's not going to run out of money. It doesn't talk about where the state exists in terms of society. It doesn't actually make contact between the relationship of the state and society, so the differentiation between the civil and political spheres. That's another way of getting at what is the difference between civil and political rights. In a sense, the bourgeois revolution was the revolution to distinguish the civil and political sphere, right? So that literally a world had grown up where it was possible to recognize somebody's property outside of their community. That's how interdependent the world became. I mean, I feel like when people hear rights, they hear it as a morality tale. It's like something you believe in. I think somebody made fun of me and said, "Oh, it's like inherent spiritualism or something."
Yeah.
No, I'm actually saying these rights became true in practice. So maybe here's another way to get at what I mean when I think of value, like labor value.
Hmm.
So famously, Marx is like, "Oh, Aristotle is not able to solve the commodity form in Nicomachean Ethics." Because Aristotle recognizes that if you exchange two chairs for a house as a random exchange relationship, that there's a third because chairs and houses are different things. They're heterogeneous things. and for them to be commensurable, for them to be compared as quantities. I don't know if do you understand what I'm saying in terms of this? Here, let me
Yeah,
step.
because yeah, they need you need a universal
Yes.
uh fuck, what's the word, equivalent or whatever.
Yeah, right. Not even a universal equivalent. You need a way of making them commensurable,
Right.
period. Right? Like, in other words, the way I usually like to put it is what is greater, the color blue or the number seven? It's like, what the fuck does that mean? But if
Right.
I say,
Yeah. Right. You can't. Yeah. They're at. Yeah. You can't actually match them to anything because there's no way to measure their value to them.
there's no way to measure them, right? But if I say seven is greater than five, then unless we're doing some trickery with some kind of group theory where it's like going in a circle or something, then yeah, people are going to accept that. Okay. So in other words, the question then becomes how do different things become commensurable? And in bourgeois society, the first property is labor, and it kind of naturally developed as such over time because again, you had runaway slaves and serfs that made up these cities. They didn't have property, and they, in a sense, only had the skills on their back that they brought from, whatever conquered territories that they used to live under, because they were the ones working. And so I don't know if Eamon, you have a sibling. I've made this
Yeah.
analogy several times on Ashley's show, but like me and my sister used to like trade chores around the house.
Hmm.
Just a natural thing. If you do this twice, I'll do that once or something like that. And so again, the question about rights was really me working backwards from going like, okay, here's another way to get at it. Because when he mentions value, he means the relative value of things. So he means that two apples are worth more than an orange or something.
Hmm.
This is just an exchange ratio. And yet the question is, how do heterogeneous things become comparable as quantities in the first place? And that I feel like is not answered by MMT. Or if they think they're answering it, then they're making the state, which to me already presupposes all these other things, the cause of such. So again, the question regarding value for me is not about relative values. By the way, that's Ricardo's regression from Adam Smith, is that he just begins with exchange value.
Hmm.
He never explains where value even comes from. Adam Smith's argument is to say, okay, the world, by the way, for Adam Smith does not operate according to the labor theory of value. For the nerds who are like, oh, Adam Smith is wrong. No, he's saying it doesn't. It ought to. It's betraying itself to the degree that it's not. And why is this the case? Because there's been this greatest revolution in human happiness, as he puts it at the end of book 3, that has forced upon people the requirement, the necessity of selling their labor in order to live, right? It's like one of these things of, this is why when people say, oh, taxation creates unemployment, we already mentioned this earlier, that was not fucking true for most of human history. You didn't go and get a job.
No.
There was no going and getting a job. I don't know if
There are
people
no
know how
jobs to get.
there were no jobs to get, and if you tried to go and get something else, your head might get fucking chopped off. I don't know if people know this, right? Like if you were in a guild, you left with your feet pointed to the sky, if you know what I mean. Right? It's like a mafia. It's like,
Hmm.
yeah, you're leaving with your feet pointed to the sky in a box. So again, the question is, what were the conditions that had to even develop such that we could talk about people's activity as representatives of their capacities and capacity qua capacity. So I think today a lot of people also don't believe, well, number one, I should come back to this. On the one hand, everybody believes the labor theory of value. On the other hand, absolutely nobody does at the same time. On the one hand, everybody believes it because everybody goes, yeah, if I worked for it, that's mine, right?
Hmm.
In other words, on what basis do you make any claim about your property? It's either that somebody gave it to you or you worked for it. The end. Okay? That's the basis. On the other hand, when people say, no, it's wrong, it's been falsified, what they're talking about is that if you were to try to explain the relative prices of things in the economy, then they start saying, oh, it doesn't make sense in terms of the immediate labor that's added at that specific job, or something. Like they'll compare prices and go, oh, maybe labor explains 70% of it, but it doesn't explain the other 30%. And that's what they think Marx is saying, let alone Smith. That is not what they're saying. That's what Ricardo was trying to argue, sort of. Not even Ricardo. Ricardo was just trying to say, in the long run, with the effects removed, then yes, relative labor values matter. That is not what Adam Smith is saying, and it sure as fuck is not what Marx is saying, who's saying that exact way of living is now in crisis. That's the point. This is why it's impossible to try to make any argument about Marxist economics, because it's like, what position are you trying to hold? The labor theory of value, but the whole point is the Industrial Revolution wrecks the labor theory of value. But on the other hand, to make the point about what capitalism is, you have to give the account of the labor theory of value. So it's like there isn't Marxist economics. There's the critique of political economy, and there's a whole thing about that. I don't want to get too much off the channel or something like that, but like this has been talked about elsewhere. Coming back to the Adam Smith, one of the reasons why Adam Smith was so revolutionary when he was talking about it is because he was saying, we can now see at any moment the way in which all of the capacities of society kind of relate in one way. So we're not talking about like, I don't know, the famous example is kind of the butcher and the baker, right? And we're just, I don't know, the butcher spends 2 hours and this other person spends 3 hours. But really what he's saying is all of the activity of society at any time is completely commensurable, right? So you know how there's this bullshit on the internet about the barista argument?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so what Adam Smith is saying is we can see the capacities of the barista, the capacity of the aircraft engineer, the capacities of, I don't know, the gym owner, the capacities of all these different things, all together simultaneously at one time. And that's actually what's being represented in money. So money has always existed. Maybe it fucking began by a prince saying, you got to pay me in Mosler bucks or something. It doesn't matter. Because the point is that there was a revolution in society that actually was able to rub up against the existing kind of feudal traditional order, divine order of things, and was able to stand on its own, to be self-subsistent. And so when I was saying the American Revolution, this kind of thing, the American Revolution is the end of this process where civil society has become so strong that it becomes, it in a sense gains political consciousness of itself. This is what's known as the Enlightenment, which is that if this is the world in which we have grown to live in, and this is a requirement for people, it's how Adam Smith begins his early draft of The Wealth of Nations in 1759, when he says, with such stunning inequality, how is it the case that people accept such a thing, right? Like, in other words, aren't they just offended by the inequality? Why don't they revolt everywhere? And he's basically like, because their nature is this world. Meaning the Enlightenment is the growing consciousness that humans produce their own nature. And it's actually manifesting on this question of labor as value. So we're not talking about really prices. We're not talking about explaining why it's, I don't know, the price is 6 as opposed to 5. We're talking about what the hell is behind the prices. What is value? Not what is exchange value. Exchange value already presupposes values. But what is, like, the being of value? What is that? What is this thing? Right? You know, there's a jazz standard. What is this thing called love? What is this thing called value? What is this? Because Adam Smith is giving a critique of political economy. All these other political economists already have used all these words. He's saying, what are they actually talking about? What are the mercantilists talking about? What is John Locke talking about when, like, why is there mercantilism for Adam Smith? Because on the one hand, John Locke is saying, on what was the basis for the English Revolution? Oh, the king had made war on his people, and we were defending the natural rights of man. That's why he's making an argument about labor as property versus inheritance as property. That's the first treatise on government. And it's not just that John Locke has a good idea, it's that this has actually become true, meaning everybody who knows anything about the English Revolution knows Parliament was totally upheld by the merchants, right? This is what Hobbes is complaining about in Behemoth. He goes, oh, these fucking merchants and stuff like this. It's also why the English Navy defeats the Spanish Armada, famously, the Invincible Armada, because they, in a sense, have the wealth of the world as a backwater country, right? Like literally a backwater that was conquered by the Europeans, in the Norman conquests, that they're able to defeat the Spanish Armada because they're able to draw on the full cooperation of the world. So coming back from John Locke to Smith, the problem is that for Locke, he's like, well, on the one hand, I recognize labor as property, but I'm having difficulty recognizing it, explaining the economy. Sound familiar? Okay. And for Adam Smith, he's like, oh, actually, Locke is contradictory. Because he arrives at saying value ultimately is on the basis of money, but it's almost like Smith is saying something that's anticipating Marx that John Locke is like reified. That he doesn't recognize that what gives money value is actually the combined cooperation of people. So again, coming back to this story of taxes, that the value is coming from the authority of the government, that simply is not the case. I mean, I could put a gun to your head and say, you owe me $200 and I give you $100. Excuse me. Put a gun to your head, say you owe me $100, I give you $200 and you give it right back to me. Right? Nothing has been created. So obviously what gets snuck into the story is that you are causing people to do things, that you're taxing them for them to then go and make the world, right? Like, almost as simple as that, like produce an economy, produce society and everything like that. And it's just kind of like, in other words, it doesn't explain why things are commensurable, right? It's not like the commensurability is originating from the government bureaucrat.
State, yeah.
Right, go ahead. I think you wanted to say some things. Yeah.
I was going to ask so in the comments and in the previous streams I did when I had Sam on, Sam's an anarchist MMTer. And this is fairly popular to have this idea that MMT itself, if used correctly, the knowledge of it, is a road to socialism. Because you can basically even out the crises of capitalism. You can choose what to fund. You can make all the greatest social programs in the world, and that you can slowly, therefore, stop having to rely on the private sector, the capitalist individually, and you can have the state kind of do everything, and then you can wither it all away and create utopia.
Yeah. Well, okay, so my immediate response is, isn't this Bernstein? But that's like maybe too easy of like a blow or something. So I remember first watching the debate and being like, wow, an anarchist that's into MMT, that was a curious thing. Now it makes total sense to me, actually. Because both in the MMT story and in the anarchist story, the state comes from without.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, it's like exogenous. I mean, this is literally the language that gets used. It's like, oh, the state is exogenous. I think there's a model that Warren has in a paper he wrote with, I forget the guy's name, Phil something, where it's like there's a vertical input of money, and then there's a horizontal, like between banks. This is where money's coming from.
Yeah.
So, of course, the state takes on the role of being something deus ex machina that just kind of comes in and makes things. So that's one thing I had. Will this be a path to socialism? Now, I understand that Sam's argument actually was that this allows me to debate with the state to show that they are like compromised in a way, meaning they could do this, but they won't do this because they have some kind of commitment or something like that.
They can give us Medicare for all, but they won't because capital needs to make its profits, and they don't want you to.
Right, which, I mean, the issue with, I have a variety of thoughts on that. One of them is like, it's funny on the sublation, like reading group, we just read this thing where it's like, actually in the US, like we already provide all sorts of healthcare to people, but it doesn't look like it's Medicare for all. It's kind of like there are like 500 programs. So when Warren said, oh, we can make things more efficient with Medicare for all, I immediately thought that's because we have like 500 programs that are there. A lot of them are underutilized. And it would simply just make things more efficient in terms of economies of scale, that it's like, okay, you could just do this all together.
Hmm.
But the issue then was saying, so here's the problem. The tone of the way in which that's put is it makes it seem like the state is like, okay, we're hired goons of the capitalist,
Yeah.
and they're going to give us a cut of the profit, and all we have to do is beat down the plebes or something. It's a little bit of I think a self-confirming narrative that the left kind of has, that the state is like, I don't, so they have either two ways of looking at it. Either the state is neutral, this is like a more Diocese view, or the state are literally like fascists that met at the Legion of Doom with the capitalists, and the capitalist is like, yeah, I'll give you a nice bonus if you just start shooting random trans black people or something. I don't know, like this is just what they're into, and they're just like involved in an evil cabal and conspiracy like that. I would say no, actually the state really originates out of a democratic demand to solve problems in society. I mean, this goes to this earlier question you said about the distinction between the civil and political sphere.
Yeah.
So let's push on the story a little bit. So what happens if people can't realize themselves as workers, which definitely MMT and I agree on that, like this happens in society. Oh, they demand for the state to do something, meaning they still have their political rights that they can try to realize their value as laborers.
Or
And
they
so
become lumpen or gangsters or.
or they become lumpen and gangsters. And really, like, gangs are just failed state actors, meaning they kind of take on, they're like local rackets, right? I mean, this is why there's always been gangs have been involved with the state, because the state's kind of like, yeah, we might be able to just use the mafia and gangs to kind of manage people in that part of the city, right? There's a lot of like shit with the police and gangs in that way. But the reason I bring that up is that, of course, the statification is driven by, you know, the masses of society demanding the state to step in and do something. And I think when the state steps in to try to represent people qua people, like in the US, it's a government for the people by the people. It's in a sense trying to manage competing interests. And so I'll give you this example. Actually, Marx writes on this in the 1850s. There's an example of the state stepping in to stop the capitalists from actually increasing the wages of the workers in response to their strikes. This also happens in Russia on several occasions. That's kind of fucking weird. It's like the state is stepping in and saying, Mr. Capitalist, I know you want to raise the wages of your workers in response to the strike. You want to give them their demand, and I'm going to stop you. Why do they do that? Because it was creating an industry-wide crisis.
Right.
In other words, they're worried if you do that, it's in a sense going to spiral into a social crisis. This is one of the reasons why it's crazy to hear the left defend like the National Labor Review Board in the US.
Yeah.
It's like this is the totally fucking mediated like way in which these things are solved. Right? Like obviously the state is like, yeah, let's set up an apparatus that will just totally structure things so that it's only legal if it's within like this kind of technocratic way of managing things. So that the state is trying to, I don't know, uphold the profit rates of the capitalists. Well, you know who else has the interest in the profit rates of the capitalists? The workers. I don't know if people know this. I don't know if you've ever worked for a bankrupt company, Eamon.
Yes,
Maybe.
I have.
You have. You worked for a bank. Okay, and they were probably filing bankruptcy to get the state to step in and help them out anyways. Unless this is like a totally corner case where it's like, no, I was working for a company that was bankrupt, losing money, and could not pay our wages because it was literally bankrupt.
Yeah, I mean the companies I've worked for that have gone under, they just went under.
No. Okay, they went. Okay, that's different. That's what I mean. I mean, are you working for a company that's like, I cannot pay your wages?
I have not, but no.
Okay, in other words, why do you have an interest in a profitable company? So they can fucking pay your wages and also even increase your wages and maybe make your life better. It's like a kind of simple point that you're probably not going to be working for long for a company that's going under and cannot pay its basic costs. or something
I
like
mean,
that.
this is obvious if you talk to any workers. Like workers are
Yeah,
like, you tell them, oh, what you need to do is fight against your company and join together. And like, well, actually, like, no, we want them to do well so that we have these jobs forever.
right. In other words, think about how the major industrial-wide strikes started. The industrial-wide strikes started because workers were getting so frequently thrown out of employment that they couldn't like identify with their employers anymore.
Yeah.
That's really where the issue was coming about. And not only that, the strikes really happened because the workers realized they had to. Uh-oh, you just dropped out.
That's just my camera overheating. I'm
Oh,
still
okay.
here.
They really happened because the workers had to organize the unorganized, right? Meaning maybe the capitalists were going for the unemployed, and the workers were like, okay, we need to get to them before then. Maybe I was being too dramatic with the question I was asking, but it's just a simple point that you actually do have an interest in the business you're working for being profitable.
Yeah,
Because if it's
absolutely.
not, you might not have a job anymore. Like, very as simple as that. And so I say that because the question then becomes what gets people to the standpoint of not even being able to identify with that anymore. And that's actually reaching a question where it's like, oh, the whole system is rotten. So coming back to Sam's point about can the state like be a path to socialism? Well, then for me, it raises just standard Marx questions about like, the state stepping in to manage things. Does that actually raise the necessity of a dictatorship with the proletariat? For an anarchist, probably not. So I don't even know if there's a point in raising that. But why do you need a dictatorship with the proletariat? Because the problem is not that the state imposes some kind of unfair regime upon the workers, but that society is actually in crisis, and that's what's necessitating the state. So in other words, let me try to pick up on two sides of the antinomy. On one side of it, you have kind of an anarchist view towards the state is our oppression is that the people with guns are upholding a kind of minority interest. And so therefore, uh, I guess in Sam's case, he's like, I would be able to expose the one-sidedness of Joe Biden. I think this is what I saw the debate. It was during Biden's presidency by saying, oh, you could provide these things, but you either are pretending you don't know this or you do know this. No, you're either pretending you don't know this or you don't know this, and I'm telling you how the monetary system works. So you would be able to create a kind of political legitimation crisis of the state.
Yeah.
Like that's one view of it. Or on the other hand, maybe going back to the question that Warren asked me at the end, when he was like, if you stand up at a football stadium, like, don't you need regulation? I would say that like the bourgeois revolution pointed towards the overcoming of needing coercion in order to uphold the freedom of society. By the way, the police, I don't know if people know this, the police like are not there to protect you. I don't know if this is a surprise to people.
They're
They're
there to
there to
smash unions.
they're there to uphold law and order. And by the way, I used to like live in several cities. It's like, you know, it's not like the police were there to protect me from people. I got mugged and shit happened to me all the time. And, when I would talk to the police, they would just be like, oh, it's because you have to file an insurance thing. It's not like they're your bodyguards or something. And as you said, yeah, they're to smash unions and they're to do something with the unemployed, right? To regulate them. Like that's why there are police. That's why they were imported into the United States because we literally imported the uniforms of the bobbies, meaning the place that originated the Industrial Revolution. Then other places had to import those uniforms because the same problem was happening in their own country. So again, why do people maybe reach for the state as a way of explaining why you need regulation today? Because the kind of immediate existence of society is that it can't regulate itself.
Yeah.
But then the question becomes, what is the reason for that? Like, if you naturalize it, then that's just right wing. It's right wing because it is liquidating the possibility of freedom. It's just saying like, oh, I don't know, people are mentally ill or maybe people have a racial view. I don't fucking know. All sorts of crazy things they might have. Whereas if it's a question about the crisis also representing the necessity to transform society, then the regulation of the state no longer becomes a way of advancing that revolution, but becomes the stopgap. So, I can keep going further on this, which is that this happened right at the beginning where we were talking about inequality. And I think Warren said, well, you should tax rich people so that they have less of an influence on the government, right? Like if you have great inequality, then wealthy people will try to bribe government officials.
Yeah.
And I just kind of thought, well, why should we assume that the state is any less corrupt?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, let's say, yeah, we went to,
Because there's some
let's say
democratic, we have some democratic rules over it or power over it in theory.
over the unelected state bureaucrat.
And well, yeah, in theory, because we elect the executive who can then.
Uh-huh. Right. So what's the problem with Doge then?
Sorry.
What's the problem with Doge then? No, I'm just Doge, right? Like in
Yeah.
other words, yeah, okay, fine. People are democratically like, yes, drain the swamp or something like that. No, I mean that's the idea. I mean, I think obviously we have plenty of examples of even you elect a president and they kind of can't do anything, and then it's even defended as a kind of great thing. I could here, this will maybe drive your chat a little crazy. Is von Mises wrong when he says, well, the mass consumer has some kind of control over the capitalist? I know people will say administered prices and aren't your decisions chosen by the, uh, cultural industry. But wait, isn't Tesla having a 50% drop in its shares right now or 40% drop in its shares?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't know. Like, in other words, all these things can be true that like, yes, mass campaigns can have an effect on businesses that go out of business. And I don't know, do people have democratic control over the state? Well, it's even perhaps more confusing is do people democratically demand a bureaucracy that they then complain about? Actually, both of those can be true.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning people democratically demand you got to do something about this unemployment. And, bippity boppity boo, what did you just do? You created the Unemployment Insurance Agency, right? Which, by the way, back in the day, the left used to have all sorts of criticisms about welfare agencies and stuff. There's a fucking movie from the 70s about it. I don't know if people know about it, right? But like, what's the movie that I'm thinking of where it's like the woman is harassed by the welfare agent or something? I'm Googling in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Keep away from me, Mr. Welfare Man. It's a fucking great song. Yeah, from Claudine, right? Or like Malcolm X talking about his family being taken away by state bureaucrats or something and put in foster homes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like the left used to have a whole critique of this, of do we need all these, leave it to Beaver administered state things? So back to this anarchist view, it's like, no, I don't know if actually the bureaucratization of society obviously can be an obstacle to socialism. Because to me, what matters is the task, the problem of society, is it becoming clear or not? I don't think the statification of society is doing that.
Right. So
Right?
if we got in a Bernie Sanders leftist government in the presidency and in Congress and even in the states, let's say, and they all embraced MMT and gave us all Medicare for all and free childcare and this, that, and the other. It gave us light rail finally everywhere, all around the country. Or not right.
I would
light
fucking
rail.
love light rail. I'd like light rail more than those other things even.
I meant, yeah, light rail, but also no. The one I was thinking of was high speed rail. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, gave us all this stuff. Okay, so some of them argue that is this not a kind of freedom in itself? Like if socialists are after freedom, this is a kind of freedom, is it not?
Right. So let me go. Thank you. I'm glad you brought that point up. So when I think of freedom, I think of the freedom of society. Right? Is society becoming more conscious of its capacity or not? And the state providing things is actually not that. That's the management of the crisis. It's actually a kind of confused way of thinking about it. And also, it goes into this old antinomy. It's like the freedom to and freedom from
Mm-hmm.
that came out of like Isaiah Berlin. So let's compare this to the 18th century, right? So that's what people usually read. They read the Two Liberties. Oh, and there was one other thing you wanted to say, which is full employment. That's an old
Yes.
argument,
Full
right?
employment, no inflation. Yeah, those were the other two.
Right. And the full employment thing, first of all, if there's full employment in the United States, there's instantly all sorts of immigration crisis at the border. I just think realistically that would be the case because people would be like, oh, the US government's going to hire anybody who gets in, let's go for it, kind of thing like that,
Yeah.
instantly. And again, like the issue with the crisis is that I remember almost 10 years ago having an immigration panel and someone said there's no immigration crisis because the US can feed everybody. And I went, that's true, but you also have to think about politics and how things are in reality, which is that based on the kind of political structure of things and I'm just going to say the like norm, it's a crisis in terms of doing things. So even though, you can speak in kind of hypotheticals that the United States could feed everybody on Earth, this is true. I hope people know this.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally the US could produce food to feed everybody on Earth. But yet why is there a population problem? There's a population problem because there's a crisis in terms of how we produce things and how we relate. And so it creates a kind of problem that cannot be explained on the basis of the kind of normal functioning of things. And so it's kind of treated in an ad hoc way. So anyways, coming back to your point about, let's say they gave us all these things. Mm-hmm. So number one, it very well could destroy any basis for, like, I think people kind of know this, that someone would go, oh, why would we ever need socialism then? And I think a lot of people who call themselves socialists today, if Obama did some great MMT Keynesian program, they might have maybe never became socialists. Maybe that's like literally where a lot of people's socialism comes from.
Yeah.
It's the dream deferred that they're like, Obama, you had the fucking chance. You put fucking Geithner and all sorts of Goldman Sachs people in your cabinet. You didn't listen to Christy Romer. By the way, this is who Stephanie Kelton brings up in her book. You could have had 1 trillion. You could have did Warren Mosler's payroll tax break. You didn't do that. Boom, we're stuck with this. And then you went back to austerity by 2010. You were a disappointment. Really has shocked a lot of millennials. So I think that's one of the basis of things. 2, if you were to get all of those things, then you would also have to think about how they would be politicized. So think of a job employment. Okay, we're going to give everybody a job who's unemployed. Mm-hmm. Obviously, then it becomes a question of what job are they doing? How does this relate to other industries? Are you creating a horde of bread and circuses of people that were just like, are we going to have them dig ditches and then they're going to be loafers? Obviously, that would create all sorts of social and cultural problems.
No, they have it. They have like ideas for what exactly type of work.
No. I know they do. That's why I'm saying that instantly becomes a political issue.
Right.
Like, yes, I know Stephanie Kelton says the care economy. I know people say, oh, yeah. By the way, Keynes famously doesn't say, oh, we can have people digging ditches and picking up gold. Yeah. He said it would be better, but we can probably put people to productive work. Mm-hmm. I'm still on my same point, which is that it instantly becomes the Republicans and Democrats go, what are they doing? Are they doing work in industries that affect my constituency or not? Mm-hmm. Right? By the way, the Frankfurt School already dealt with this. 1942, the authoritarian state. Unemployment has become organized. That was Horkheimer's way of putting the state, is that it literally is the organization of the unorganized. It's almost like a play on the old socialist slogan, that the state is the organization of the unorganized, of the unemployed. Louis Bonaparte, he gives full employment. You know how he does that? He gives poor people guns.
War, yeah.
And goes, oh, not even war. He goes, go shoot those capitalists. Do people fucking know this? You want a full employment program?
Yeah, he was the socialist.
Yeah, exactly. There's your full employment. We're going to pay you to go shoot the capitalists. People were like, I would do that for free. So in other words, the second this happens, it becomes, not only politicized, but, even in the early 20th century, late 19th century, they used to talk about patronage. And they used to talk about corruption. And it's like Tammany Hall and getting jobs, and it's a racket and these kinds of things. I mean, full employment can just be like the state just built itself an army to go and kill the socialists and stop them. And it becomes political football between the Democrats and Republicans. Oh, we're hiring too many people for your bullshit jobs, so now we want our other bullshit jobs.
Hmm.
And then, I don't know, the US is still going to exist in the world, and people might go, oh, this is why I said the loafers kind of thing. Meaning, I'm not saying whether or not this is going to be true. I'm saying people are going to politicize it as such.
Hmm.
Oh, you're having them do unproductive barista bullshit, right? This is what all the Stalinists say on the internet,
Yeah.
right? Oh, they shouldn't be doing that. They should be like, they should be like Xi Jinping and going to the countryside and like doing hard labor or something like that instead of being princelings or things like that. I'm just trying to say that like the full employment is not going to necessarily translate to the collective argument where it's like, oh, we're just building up the leverage of the workers' movement.
Mm.
That would obviously be destabilizing. And not only is it destabilizing, but if you're supporting the government full employment program, you just handed over the keys to them. You just tailed them. Right? In other words, you just said, yeah, you guys are organizing us.
Right. Yes.
Right? Like
Yeah.
there used to be this argument, like like here's another thing. So health insurance. In Bismarckian Germany, why does Bismarck put like a health insurance, like some kind of pension and health insurance into place? Because he's trying to counter the socialists who are doing the same. So when people are making an argument for a state, it's like you're giving the policy advice to the state. And if the state takes it over, then it becomes a thing that you're rendering yourself superfluous. So that's why for me, I'm like, I guess people think number one, people seem to not think there's such a thing as society,
Hmm.
right? In other words, they're like, oh, like this was the argument about like, if your property is not protected, therefore it doesn't exist. And I'm kind of like, well, number one, what does it mean to protect your property? Does that mean the state? The state is not there to protect your property. I don't know if people know that, right? It's not. This is why we're just talking about the police are not there to like protect you or something like that. That's why, by the way, this is one of the arguments for why you have a right to a gun is because if somebody breaks into your house, it's not like, oh, call 911. It's like you have to probably defend yourself. So the state is not like, the state, number one, is not there to protect your property. And number two, property doesn't originate with the state. So even if you're saying the state is not protecting my property, then it would become an argument of where does property come from? What is that? And on what basis can you therefore say the state is not upholding its duty? I don't know if that's clear. We should maybe dig into that. But the property doesn't come from law. Law already presupposes property. Otherwise, on what basis can you say who gets to have any input in the laws? Vote for representatives to have any say on the laws. Politics presupposes all these things.
Hmm.
I don't know. Say more, Eamon. Maybe I'm totally eating my words.
Well,
Say
I
more.
actually, what you just were talking about was reminding me of another thing I wanted to bring up, which is how my old organization, the IMT, now the RCP, talked about not just MMT, but economics in general and property, or actually the state. Part of what they say is what they'll teach you is the state exists to protect the surplus or the property of the ruling class, and they'll also say that MMT, they'll use the same arguments that the libertarians will talk about. Will say about MMT. MMT is a magic money tree. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. It'll just create inflation. Somebody has to pay when at the end, and it's always going to be the working class. That's why the capitalists institute austerity now. So yeah, there's a couple things to pick up on there, but like, is there any value in a Marxist, let's say a socialist party, having clear analysis on MMT or understanding it, and versus giving the old kind of Austrian analysis to to economic questions
Yeah.
in their newspaper every couple weeks?
I think so. In other words, in the discussion, I tried to approach it as I want to learn, and obviously, Warren said the same thing back to me at the end, maybe more teasingly because I guess I didn't say anything Marxist.
Hmm.
Meaning that, like, what would actually be my critique of MMT? That it's a real form of appearance. But of course, that sounds like magical mumbo jumbo to people. Like, okay, this is Marx talk, Marx esoterica. But it's ideology, not in the Althusser sense of it being like, I don't know, illusion. Not in I don't even know what the fuck the Zizek sense is. Maybe somebody can correct me there or something. I mean
Not
it
an
in the
Althusser guy,
Marxist.
so I couldn't tell you.
I mean it in the Marxist sense that practice is ideological.
Hmm.
And so when I say it's ideology, I mean it's true, right? In other words, to me, the real task of the Marxists would be to explain the necessity of this. And that's why I kept mentioning the banking school,
Hmm.
meaning that whereas for Adam Smith, wealth was the, labor fund of society, and he was able to reflect on if humans are produced by society, what's manifesting in the modern commercial society, in a sense, is their potential. That's why he's not really interested in the relative value between apples and oranges, but about what does potential look like? It looks like surplus labor, right? It looks like what does the potential of society look like? It looks very indeterminate. It looks like value qua value. It looks like production for production's sake. That was a positive thing for him. That by the time you get to Marx, those forms of social relations have become undermined such that they only now manifest in a kind of estranged manner, going back to what Marx called estranged labor.
Hmm.
And Marx had a phrase for estranged labor. It's called capital. And he wrote, I don't know, 4 fucking books on it, maybe more, right? So the point is that from the standpoint of capital, it actually begins already with the estrangement over labor. This is why a very young Marx says, I'm not going to do what the economists do and go back to some primordial period. This is actually the point of what Adam Smith is doing. Meaning Adam Smith is giving the justification of bourgeois society, whereby it's not an argument about barter becomes money. This is what I feel like some of your old IMT buddies think is like what they have to defend,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because again, barter's always existed, money's always existed. It's rather that previous society can only be understood as developing into bourgeois society.
Hmm.
Thierry is really good on this, I think, in his histories, where he almost talks about what happened in the towns as the accumulation of like Roman law and Christianity, and even the barbarians played a part, and like Greek philosophy, that literally bourgeois society is the embodiment of history, right? If you think about even something as simple as the phrases that Marx uses, the worker who has nothing but the labor on their back, that's an extraordinary fucking development in human history. That you can literally exist on the basis of nothing but the labor on your back presupposes that you can go and work for a wage. We were
Presupposes a
talking about
lot. Yeah. That
we were
couldn't have
talking
been
about this.
possible any other time.
Of course not. Right. We were talking about this at the end of the Mosler discussion, which is like, in order to demand taxes from people in the standpoint of like money, they have to live by money. And for them to live by money, it means that all of their needs have to be like purchasable
Hmm.
in money, or at least like a great dominance of them. And in order for that to be the case, people have to be working with the presupposition that other people are doing this other thing and this other person is doing this other thing, such that money comes to represent labor qua labor, right? Meaning it's not that Marx has a labor theory of value. It's not that the labor theory of value can even explain, like, even was possible up until bourgeois society. To quote Marx from chapter 1 of volume 1, it only becomes possible because such an infinite degree of different human activities were constantly being related, that their intersection, their nexus even, could even be reflected upon as an object. And that's what's being kind of crystallized in money.
Hmm.
So it's not this bullshit, and I'm sorry, now I'm going to get a little, a little uppity about this shit. Because it's a little bit of a myth, motherfuckers. Oh, it's the barter to money thing. No, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The point is that one has to give an argument about what does money mean now. And so even with the MMT story, they just presuppose bourgeois society. Oh, taxes produce unemployment. You didn't always have unemployment. Oh, we're purchasing goods and services. That didn't always fucking happen. Not only that, what does Warren say in soft currency economics? He goes, oh, the economy is like a storeroom where goods and services resolve into profit and wages. That's Adam Smith. This is what Marx would later call Adam Smith's mistake. There's a long argument there. You can go listen on Ashley Friley's podcast about it. But the point is that all of modern bourgeois society just gets presupposed into the argument. Now, coming back to your friends, what your friends do, I mean your IMT friends,
Yep.
is that they've read the words of Das Kapital, and now I'm going to sound annoying for a second, they haven't really got the spirit of it. They don't really know what the object of critique is. That it's critiquing political economy. And not, when I say that, I don't mean Ricardo and Adam Smith, I mean the workers' movement. The workers' movement is politicizing political economy. And so to me today, back to your question, what should one make of MMT? It's like, I treated it like a real form of appearance. And I'm like, okay. And so therefore for me, it's not about throwing the falling rate of profit against it. It's about, where does this necessity come from? What is even like the conditions of possibility of it, which we sort of got at? And what does it mean? To me, I'm also, of course, interested in why is the left interested in it? Let me say another thing about this. So I found an article I remember reading from many years ago. It was published on New Year's Eve of 2011 in The Economist. The article is called Marginal Revolutionaries. It starts off talking about Warren, and it has like a little painting, in fact, on it. I just want to pull it up. In The Economist, Marginal Revolutionaries, The Economist. It has like a painting on the front, which it kind of looks like I can't really quite tell what's happening, but it's liberty leading the people. And it's like, the painting from like the American Revolution. Here, I'll put it in the link right here. Okay, yes. And the reason I bring it up is because I think the article captures the kind of millennial headspace towards economics, which is that people of our cohort remember the 2008 financial crisis, remember the very slow recovery, remember the bullshit about austerity. I mentioned the Tea Party. I said, Warren, look, I used to read your things because I was going to go argue with these Tea Party motherfuckers. Right? Oh, they're telling me the government's like a household and they can't pay for this, but these people are like stuck in the 16th century or something. And the article just kind of says, look, what's new about this generation is they have such a distrust of mainstream economics. And it's also when the blog sphere was kind of blowing up that they're like, heterodox economics is more popular than it's ever been. This kind of thing like that. Now, for me, I'm like, that's both very interesting and very characteristic about the millennials. It's also a little bit of an Achilles heel. Because what it means is that you've had a lot of dilettantes. I hate to put it like this. You know what, everybody can throw this all at me. It's me, obviously. Like I mentioned reading these blogs. And it's like their education in economics was like just shit they read off of somebody's blog, and it was like a heterodox theory. And then they kind of create these self-serving myths about what they call mainstream economics, or even worse, people say neoclassical. That's even worse to me because it's like neoclassical economics hasn't existed for almost 100 years. Meaning mainstream shit is all like randomized controlled trials and machine learning today. Like nobody is really that bound up with like, certain assumptions from like the 1940s.
You still get a lot of like Austrian diehards on the internet though somehow.
The Austrians don't think of themselves as neoclassical, of course.
A lot of these. That's interesting because a lot of these people consider themselves neoclassical.
So the Austrians would say like, no, neoclassical. It turned economics into math and things like this, and it made it something where like what the Austrians, by the way, are sometimes good on is it's because they're obsessed with certain things. They're very sensitive that they'll say, oh, there's a problem with aggregation because you're aggregating heterogeneous things. And they kind of think it's like a little like sophistry on the part of mainstream economics that they aggregate things into GDP and into accounting identities,
Right.
and they therefore abstract away from true heterogeneous qualitative differences. And by the way, Marx might agree with that. Rosa Luxemburg might agree with that. Not in the way that they say it, but they would go, oh, they're sensitive to this kind of thing. That they're like kind of scoring a point right there. But like when I think of neoclassical economics, I'm thinking of like, sort of famously when Keynes says the neoclassical economics, he does not mean Smith and Ricardo. He means like Arthur Pigou, right? He means like, people that are, he means like Marshall or somebody like this. It's like kind of turn of the century, early 20th century kind of economics views like that. And if I remember correctly, I'm trying to think if it's at the beginning of Marshall's Principles of Economics. Even Alfred Marshall, at the beginning of his Principles of Economics, says something like, economics was not possible until recently. I gotta find it. I'll probably send it to you afterwards, Eamon. But he's like, people used to be like more aware of these things, and then it just totally drops out by, at the very least, post-World War II. Mm-hmm. So the reason this article, I was reminded of this, is because I feel like it touches on the tone of what economics has meant to our generation. It's also why a lot of Marxists are so fucking obsessed with the falling rate of profit. Because for them, it's like the only thing that ever happened in the last like 30 years was that there was the 2008 crisis. And for them, it fits this like, oh, there was a falling rate of profit from the 70s. They never recovered, something like this. And so this is what proves Marx to them. And so therefore, anytime the stock market drops like a correction, they're like, oh, it's a falling rate of profit. It's a falling rate of profit. I stubbed my toe. It's a falling rate of profit. Kind of thing.
Well,
like
the stock market isn't.
Isn't the economy? I agree.
Yeah.
Right. No. I'm saying that any signal, they just say it's the falling rate of profit. I'm not saying this is the falling rate of profit. Mm-hmm. Kind of thing like that. And yeah, no, and obviously, if the stock market is forward-looking, if the falling rate of profit was really that fucking predictable, the stock market would know it way sooner than these Marxist economists, because it would constantly be thinking about earnings, the forward-looking 12-year earnings and going, oh, there's nowhere for it to go. I mean, this is all that people think about. The Wall Street Journal just had an article about it today. Don't blame Trump on the tariffs. There's also poor earnings.
Yeah, but the stock market hasn't really, like, for a long time, it hasn't been based on what the actual economy and companies are doing. It's based on it's a gambling show now.
I mean, that was another thing that I was a little like, I don't know. Like, what about the fact that maybe the stock market is the condition for socialism?
Explain that.
Oh, I mean, I know you have a Trotskyist background, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I say Lenin, this isn't that crazy. No. Without big banks, socialism's impossible.
Well, I mean, Trotsky talks about taking over the banks in the transitional program, so...
Yeah, of course. In other words, the whole question is whether or not all of this is an expression of the interdependence of society. Meaning, when people say it's gambling, here, I'll bring up Yanis Varoufakis. Mm-hmm. I was surprised for him to say this. Maybe you should get him on the show and he can attack me, but this is me attacking him right now. Not attacking, just slight criticism. He was, like, interviewed, and he said something about waking up in London. He woke up, the stock market was, I don't know, whatever percent. Let's say it's I'm just going to index it, it was at 100. And he said, then it went down to 70, and then it was at 150 by noon. And he goes, this is not capitalism. And I'm like, no, this is capitalism. Right? In other words, when people say it doesn't add up with the economy, well, Marx already fucking talked about this. In other words, the discrepancy between, interest-bearing capital and real capital, right, industrial capital, that's actually a necessary expression of the separation of the means of production and the producers, right? That form goes all the way up. That's literally the logic of capital, right? Of his text is the fetish form is kind of pushing itself forward. And so the reason I bring this up is it's like, to just say it's gambling is to kind of make it like unessential. Like it's just like a random thing.
They've taken something essential, and because there's so well, this is the theory. Because there's so little profitability and long term kind of stability in the market, then it becomes this Ponzi scheme and this gambling racket at the same time.
It
Where you
becomes a gambling racket and a Ponzi. What do you mean?
Look, a Ponzi scheme in the sense that like you're you're trying to, like, the fact that all these other people are in it, you're trying to be one step ahead of them and, like,
Uh-huh.
sell right before the rest of them. And like these tokens, all these Bitcoin tokens, like this is a kind of a symptom of where the economy's at now.
So you said earlier that they took something that was essential. So what did you mean by that? Just before I comment, just so I don't I want to make sure I got your point right. Like the stock market was essential, but now it's been.
Right. Well, I mean, like, it's essential to capitalism, as in, like, you need investors to invest into your public companies in order to in theory reinvest in your production and create more
Uh-huh.
profits and
Financing.
valorization.
Yeah, no, it's a real expression of the fact that capital is social power, right? In other words, to quote the Communist Manifesto, there's not like individual businesses anymore. Production has become socialized. I think I wrote an article for Sublation about Shark Tank, and I just said, well, there's something kind of paradoxical about the fact that if you follow the point that Marx is making, that those people that are trying to get the sharks to invest in them, in fact, they're already all swimming in the same thing,
Sure.
right? Meaning that Marx's point is that there's not really individual factories anymore. We act as if there are. That's bourgeois property. We,
Right.
we talk as if there's the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. But actually, the industrial side of things, this is where the contradiction is. So we have bourgeois social relations and industrial forces. Forces is a very important term, meaning it manifests. So it's not like you directly see, oh, that's the potential of society. We see it in a kind of indirect way. It's, Hegel's term of force, that it kind of manifests, it kind of reflects back upon bourgeois social relations. We actually only know of the potential of industrial potential precisely in how it breaks through bourgeois social relations. It's actually a phrase that was coined before Marx by a guy named Schultz, had already said, oh, we have this contradiction of forces and relations, kind of Hegelian influence. So coming back to the Yanis Varoufakis point, what I'm trying to say is that for him, he's like, this doesn't make sense on the basis of bourgeois property. And I'm saying capitalism is and isn't bourgeois property at the same time. So people get kind of caught up in trying to nail it down on one side or the other, right? When they say profiteering, that's a bourgeois form. They're trying to say, look at the money that's going to this person. They talk about inequality, right? I think Warren was surprised to hear me say I don't give a shit about like inequality, let alone somebody gambling like on a lottery. I don't know why I would give a shit. It usually is poor people who are gambling. Why would I want to penalize them anyways, if they got lucky on this? But rather it's one of these things that inequality is in the sunlit realm. That's in the rational realm. That's on the basis of bourgeois relations that I say Warren has millions more dollars than I have. So the problem with capitalism is that we relate on this basis, but then in practice, we actually violate that basis. Meaning when people say Karl Marx is a labor theory of value, if you read the first chapter of Capital, he just says, I'll use the shirt that you're wearing right now. If I said, Eamon, that NWO shirt that you're wearing right now is the representation of universal abstract labor, Marx says, the absurdity is self-evident. The absurdity is self-evident, right? It's like, we all know, like, what do you mean it's the universal incarnation of labor? Like, there's all these machines and all, like, literally all of society is involved in that, right? And it's fucking NWO. It's like the 90s, and there was the NWO Wolfpack, right? Like, we know all these fucking things, right? There's all these things that are involved. And yet, when you bought that shirt, you related to the person across the counter, I'm just metaphorically speaking, as if you were exchanging your labor, that it was
Yep.
your money, and they were selling you this product that counted on the basis of bourgeois social relations. So when I say this, like, when people say gambling and things like that, the reason I react to that is I'm like, well, but that's also an expression of the potential of society that's constantly breaking through bourgeois social relations. And it seems irrational to us. I had this conversation, a mutual friend of the show, Ashley Frowley, I had a conversation with her once in New York. We were walking around Wall Street, It was like a funny little thing. Like I was having this conversation with Ashley while we're like walking around on Wall Street. And it was one of these things where it was like, no, it's actually possible that the potential of the stock market is underutilized.
Oh, 100% it's underutilized.
100%. Yeah.
Like
Right.
that's
And
massively underutilized.
massively. And so that's why for me it's like when I think it came up like, oh, we could like destroy the finance industry or something and just turn it into fundamental investors, which by the way, I don't think that would actually kill that much of the bloat. It might even create all sorts of new kinds of bloat if we just had fundamental dividend traders or something. You know, that's kind of my ballpark of investing, just so.
Right. I think a big part of it though is what he was saying was get rid of the bonds basically. Get rid of the bond market. You still
I
have the
mean,
stock market.
the bond market, by the way, like I guess it depends on what kind of bond investor you are. Meaning, if you're just taking a fucking coupon and you're not trading it, like there's not a lot of trading that's happening, and it's even hard to be active in the bond space because you have like credit and duration. There's not much there.
Yeah.
He meant like stocks. He meant stock traders or something like that. But even then, it's like,
I mean, I know he wants
yeah.
to get rid of the bond market. He thinks they're like treasuries and all that's useless.
Yeah, right. No, I did read, I didn't know at the time when I talked to him, but I did read this PowerPoint I found on the internet afterwards where he talks about like unlimited credit to banks and unlimited overdrafts and all of these things because I didn't know what the program was. I guess my simple point is that like if the question is literally could that policy like work in the most high possibility sense, I guess it could, sure. It could be a total disaster in all sorts of ways, but like things can work in capitalism. I don't know, Trump's Gaza plan might work, but you know what I mean? Like I just am watching your face when I said that, like it might literally work. It's not isn't
It'll
going to
work
be
for
good.
someone. It'll work for in
It'll
some
work
way
for
somehow.
someone. Yeah, and so like these things could like work, but I just kind of know they would be bound up with like all sorts of crazy things that we might not even be able to know. I just hear it really as, and now I'll start to use the Marxist language, just, you know, petty bourgeois discontents with the stock market. Oh, it's a bunch of parasitical gamblers or something. And I'm just like, yeah, I don't, you know, I don't know. Once you get into that ballpark, then I'm like, can I say the same with the fucking bureaucracy?
You can absolutely say the same with the bureaucracy.
Okay, so Doge, let's go. Elon Musk, he's right.
He might be, but they would the argument would be I don't want to go too far down this road, but
Why not? It's
that this is
unconscionable.
that this is Doge his existence is some betrayal of the you know rights and the rules of civil society.
That whose
That he is
argument was it?
he is infringing on our rights by circumventing
Oh,
the norms or whatever.
right. The argument about what Elon Musk is doing is has
Yeah,
he usurped power and stuff? Yeah,
yeah.
and I could say the same thing about people who are like, you know, one of the reforms was that you would force every company to have to offer unlimited shares. Is that not an infringement upon people's property rights?
Sure.
Right. So again, you know, to me, it's like I don't know what maybe you were asking me like what is my Marxist view on this or something. That's why I just said it's like oh it's reacting to symptoms. When I was at Occupy Wall Street, I remember running around telling people we should have a security exchange transaction tax. I don't know if you remember this, but the idea is
Yes, I
that
remember this.
right if you taxed trading, you basically increase the you know bid cost spread that it would make the market less volatile. Um, you know, maybe, who knows, maybe not. I just think I'm just not interested in that. I'm really interested in what is the point of society. I mean, I've noticed that sometimes I kind of take these things for granted that the left is about freedom. That in its
that's a rough. You're gonna have a hard time taking for granted that.
I I was even going to say another thing that like, you know, society, what's the point of society? Didn't we basically enter into society to enslave people and to genocide people and to drop bombs on people and kill people and all these things? And it's kind of like, you know, is society worth like you can just like totally open up the entire existence of human civilization and go, you know, what are we doing? Is this just glittering misery? What's the point of this? This is Kant's phrase, glittering misery.
Hold on, actually,
Or
yeah. Let me interrupt you here. This
Yeah.
is like when you get into almost any sect or Marxist party or Socialist party, and they have you read Manifesto Day One. It's that there are classes.
Right.
There are the bourgeoisie, the proletariat. There's some middle classes in there. There's a lumpen proletariat. That's what society is. Like they don't this question of what is society is not lingered on, or it's bypassed, or it's just thought of like, yeah, it really all gets melded into these two great classes, and that's all really there is to talk about.
Right. No, absolutely. Like society, when I had asked those questions to Warren, it wasn't that it was literally directed at him in a lot of ways. I knew it was the audience listening who might be leftists that I was kind of trying to say, what are these things that usually drop out? Meaning, on the one hand, nobody talks about society. They say the word, they do the Joker meme, and they mean like culture and community, and they mean people's opinions. But when I say society, I mean the deep sociality that has literally created the consciousness in your brain in the first place, right? That literally what you identify with as your deepest thoughts in your mind actually is a social function.
You're getting
That's,
Lacanian on me now.
well, I'm getting Rousseauian on you, which is that what's presupposed in self-consciousness, right? What's presupposed in the actual recognition of yourself, right? In other words, why are we not slaves to our instincts and we simply react? Why do we act? Why do we have purposes even? In other words, we're ascribing purposes to why the state taxes people. We say, oh, it's doing X, Y, and Z. These are all powers of society, philosophy. I'll never forget, like Rousseau. I mean, I not only do I take for granted that the left is about freedom, I take for granted all this shit about society. That I guess people just think humans just fell out of the sky as fully formed conscious beings, and then society is like a handy thing that we're in or something. It's like convenient. I think I saw somebody write in the comments like, oh, taxes are just what you pay for civilization. You can go your own way if you want. And it's like, you actually can't go your own way. And it's not just that all of the earth is cultivated. It's that you are society. It's why Karl Marx says that when you philosophize deep in the woods, you are society thinking. That all of your thoughts are rational forms. This is how they used to put it. They're universals. They're social forms. They're forms of rationality. It's why Rousseau just says, look, philosophy would not be possible without language, because what language allowed is it gave one form to be able to think at variance with the kind of immediate world. And language is something that is cultivated in society. It's absurd to think about Robinson Crusoe inventing language for themselves. It's literally intercourse between. So when I say all of these things, I notice that I probably do take all these things for granted, but Adam Smith is like fully Rousseauian. He's the guy who's translating Rousseau. And so when he's talking about labor as value, he's not talking about like economics, by the way, coming back to this. He's talking about that civilization has gone through a revolution such that your very being, your human being, your social being, this is the words that Marx used, has actually become an object in society. And that the market and money and all these things is simply the form in which it's actually presenting itself. It's why in book 5, he actually goes through like earlier social forms, because he's trying to say what led to why this has become intelligible to us in the first place. So Adam Smith is basically saying, not only should the world be regulated according to labor, but I can actually recognize this because I am a product of that world, of that kind of development. So where were we going with this? Oh, classes in society. So class is an expression of the self-contradiction of society, of the regression of society. And that's why, coming back to this point, we were talking earlier about why the state could be a problem. Like if you're relying on the state, in a sense, you're burying the self-contradiction. You're kind of like, on what basis is the self-contradiction going to be overcome? On the basis of it becoming conscious for itself, overcoming itself. Meaning, contradiction is simultaneously the condition of the problem and the solution at the same time. Right? It makes itself an object because it's contradictory. It makes itself known and intelligible because it's contradictory. This is not a, I'm not doing the Lacanian thing, I'm doing the Marx thing.
Yes.
That we even talk about value, really, for Marx, because it's contradictory. Because it's only manifesting as a kind of problem. I think I saw somebody in the comments wrote socially necessary labor time, right? They just like throw the whole phrase out. So there's no socially necessary labor time for Adam Smith because there's no crisis of labor, right? There becomes a crisis of labor such that it's necessitating the determination of socially necessary labor time, right? Because it's like, okay, there's all of this expended labor that's totally wasted. There's superfluous labor. There's unemployed people that we can't explain. Right? And the unemployment for Marx is not that an economy crashes, it's that society is literally like superfluous. There's too much civilization. So if you treat it as economics, it's like, okay, there's a labor problem. How are we going to solve this? Is it going to be that the market calibrates, or is it going to be that the government has to step in and provide jobs? Marx's point is neither is the point, because the question is, what is the content of the unemployment? Right? Meaning Marx's point is not, does a market crash? Who gives a fuck? That doesn't matter. Yeah, a market crashes. Okay, leave it to some nerd at the Federal Reserve to tell me this is why they overinvested in, this asset or something. Fine, whatever. That's not Marx's interest. Marx's point is that the unemployment is actually an expression of the overpotential of society. Right? And so if it turns into a question of the state, then you're actually, kind of repressing the contradiction, repressing the way in which the potential can be made intelligible and conscious. And this is why political independence is so important. Because what is the proletariat doing by taking up political power? It's actually pushing forward its own self-contradiction. I've now used the term proletariat, citizens without property. They can't realize themselves in civil society, so they're seeking a political outlet. Marx's point is that is contradictory because bourgeois society has become contradictory, so that what you're doing with your political rights is you're actually trying to uphold your oppression in civil society. That's the kind of unconscious way in which it's playing out. Meaning, oh yeah, what are the workers demanding? Give me wage slavery. 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 I want to be a wage slave. Please, 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 please. Yes. Like class oppression, it's not about rich people. It's about bourgeois property. It's labor. Think about how fucking crazy this is. I don't think people think about what is really quite meant by this. What is oppressing the workers? It's bourgeois property. What is labor? Bourgeois property. What are the workers demanding? Bourgeois property. Right? And so when people giggle at that, like, I'm not making fun of you on this. It's because at an immediate level, it doesn't mean anything. But this is why for Marx, his point is the logic of what the workers were already doing, if it was to follow through on its end, would actually open up that contradiction at a social level, at a practical level, at a political level, that it actually could be made like tractable and actually overcome. And so I mentioned society earlier, okay? So let's say the economy doesn't crash and there's perfect inflation for the rest of history, whatever. I don't know, like no inflation. Is socialism still necessary?
Yes.
Why?
Because, you're still not realizing the potential of society. You're still.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's what separates you from like someone being right wing. Because by the way, that might sound fucking insane.
But that's everybody on the left.
That's what the left is supposed to be. Right.
That's everybody who's on today's left.
That they would say that the potential of society?
No, they would say that you can stop there. They would say that if we get no inflation, full employment, you reduce inequality, and you have social mobility, whatever that means, then that's the world we want to live in.
Right, because the simple point is that bourgeois right has become anachronistic as a form of expressing the potential of society. So I think I mentioned it at the beginning, and I probably didn't go into it enough. So bourgeois society, grows up in the towns, and it is one of relating on the basis of your work. So labor becomes the basis of making things commensurable. In other words, on what basis do unlike things become commensurable? Because they are the property of laborers. I think I said earlier that bourgeois society is like Christianity embodied in practice. By the way, I'm going to say this at 2 days at a labor forum, which is that, yeah, in other words, bourgeois society takes the phrase that we're all brothers in the eyes of God and puts it into practice. Yeah, you all are brothers. You're all laborers. And so we think of the rights that we hold, that we take for granted, even as ideals today, that we're equal and that you have your liberty, right? Equality, liberté, and fraternité. They are expressions of what already happens in exchange, that you're already equalizing. You're making unlike things equal. By the way, inequality is a form of equality. It's refracted equality, right? Like, in other words, if I turn the color blue into the number 5 and it's lower than the number 7, right? They're unequal in terms of quanta, but as qualities, they're equal. They're equal qualities. So this is what's happening in terms of the commensurability. Obviously, liberté, meaning trade, presupposes the freedom of the contracting parties, at least in the exchange, meaning otherwise it's robbery. It's actually pretty straightforward. I'm not saying do you have to trade to feed yourself or if it's a leonine treaty. It's just simply the case that even if it's the only job in town, you still have to sign the contract. Right? Bourgeois society presupposes your freedom. And by the way, I know this to be the case because if you actually were unfree, like if people were like, you're an unfree person, then you can't be charged for your crimes.
Right. You would just be thrown in prison, or just go straight to the
Or
punishment.
shot, or fucking shot,
Yeah.
right? Like, in other words, what do we do with a wild animal if it attacks me? I just fucking shoot it.
Yeah, you go right for the judgment or the execution.
Right, you go for the execution. In other words, if I go into if I go on a safari and a lion eats my ass, right? Let's just go for it, right? We don't charge the lion with murder because we don't say, okay, the lion was free and made a decision to make a nice meal out of Daniel because he looks delicious. I'm going to do something like that. It's just nature. There's no right or wrong in nature. There's just simply survival. And so I'm saying this because, of course, what's presupposed in bourgeois society actually is your liberty, right? If you're even going to charge somebody with a crime, at least that's the presupposition in it. If people want to find examples of the abuse of that, that's fine, but it actually doesn't violate the general principle, right? In fact, it violates it only because the principle is presupposed and says, oh, this is a case where it was a wrong judgment. When people are like wrongly accused of a crime, that's all I'm saying, right? By the way, the other thing I should have mentioned with civil rights is obviously the Khalil Mahmoud case is one of these ones where it's like, doesn't he have a civil right of free speech? Yes. You know what case I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. And so then it becomes this question of like, because I know you might be like, why does Chris and Spencer kind of mention this? So then it becomes the question of like the permanent residency being a political question. And so then this becomes the legal thing of what's presupposed, whether or not this is right or wrong in signing up for the permanent residency or green card or thing like that. But the Constitution, which, by the way, people write on this all the time, the idea of like citizenship in the US is really like a post-Constitution thing. Because it used to just be that the Constitution was supposed to appeal to like anybody who came to this land.
Yeah, it applies to everybody.
Applies to everybody. Yeah, it applies to everybody today. And that's, by the way, why there's a case, right? Like, in other words, why is FIRE going to say, oh, this is a violation of Khalil's rights? Right? I don't know. I mean, if people think rights are political, then there's no violation. But obviously, this is a controversial thing because it's like, I don't know, is the Trump administration going to play on this legal bullshit from this whatever precedent of the 1956 case against the communists? Or no, actually, his bourgeois rights, that you have a right to free speech and association. I think actually probably the best case for him is that if the evidence for whatever him distributing just doesn't exist, then it's like, yeah, this is fucking stupid. I don't, you know what I mean?
Right, because they did cite some things, and maybe that was a mistake on their part, the government.
Right, right, absolutely, right, absolutely. And by the way, either way, I don't want this person deported or something. I mean, it's fucking terrible in all sorts of ways. Anyways, I just went down that route to say, obviously, people recognize the difference between civil and political activity all the time. So coming back to the question of the Industrial Revolution and value, then, that society based on the comparison of labor time was undermined in the Industrial Revolution because sort of what happened is that the combined activity of the laborers, I'm trying to really make things very short, was politicized, right? These are the kind of chapters 13, 14, and 15 in Das Kapital, where their cooperation was politicized by them in order to make claims on society. And through the process, they basically separated their own cooperation from themselves. That's why when Marx talks about the separation of the means of production from the producers, he means that the workers used to own their skills, literally, and really their cooperation. I'll put it even at that level. And that what's happening in the Industrial Revolution, it's as if the commensurability that was there, that Adam Smith is describing, has itself become contradictory. As if there's almost two kinds of commensurability. I'm putting it in a phenomenal form, as if there's the commensurability of labor, which is when you were buying that relations upon which you paid for that shirt and gave the money over to the person, and then the commensurability in terms of how the shirt was produced. That, you know, in a sense, it's the cooperation of machines. And when I say the cooperation of machines, I don't mean in the factory, I mean at the global scale. In a sense, the cooperation of machines has no spatial distinction. The dye on the shirt, the stitching on the shirt, the cotton on the shirt, the chemicals that went into the shirt, all of the processes that went into the shirt, the supply chain that went into the shirt, the financing of the shirt. This is why I was defending the stock market earlier. The bonds that went into the shirt, the social conditions, the nostalgic memories that we have of watching Hulk Hogan versus, like, I don't know, I guess it was the Big Show was part of NWO or Kevin Nash or something.
Yeah.
Like fucking duke it out. That all of those things are all one thing that's all kind of presupposed. And so whereas Adam Smith talked about it as laborers, it's almost as if there's the embodied social capacity is another form of commensurability, right? It's the cooperation of machines. It's machine time. And, you know, to something that's very popular for people, the falling rate of profit. So the falling rate of profit was good for Adam Smith because it meant the freedom of labor. It meant that it was unconstrained by monopolies. It meant that it basically meant that the general interest of society was being appropriately received. What I mean is that, yes, your employer is going to get a profit off of you, but the falling rate of profit means that the condition of society is leading them to have to reinvest it and reinvest it in the interest of society. It need not even be your particular interest, but just in the interest of society. What's happening with the falling rate of profit with Marx is that it's really expressing the contradiction between labor time and machine time. And that's why it's not about profit going to zero. It's that the needs of the accumulation of capital and what can be afforded by labor time are incommensurate. And so coming back to this point about quantity and quality, it's as if value, which is its quality is quantitative, right? You're comparing different amounts of time. It's as if it's becoming de-actualized, as if it's losing its quality. It's the destruction of social relations. And so the reason I bring this up is that this kind of social crisis manifests in all sorts of forms, classically in unemployment, but also in violence and crime, drugs, fentanyl, this shit. And that ends up leading to a society that can't regulate itself. By the way, the earliest way in which Engels ever paid attention to capitalism was growing crime. We're not even talking about unemployment. It's just the antisocial behavior of people. because in a sense, they couldn't actually relate to each other on the basis of the social relations that they were integrated into. They were breaking down. And so such a breakdown leads to antisocial competition, violence, all these kinds of things like that. Violence against the capitalists, even, like these are not good things. And the reason I bring that up is that these are the conditions that give rise to the state. And when I think about when there started to be a problem in terms of money, like the commodity money, gold, it's concomitant with the Industrial Revolution. So the banking school and currency school start to get into it in the 1820s. It's when Ricardian socialism is happening. And this is, why is it that metal was a representative of money when it was? Well, one, it was between sovereigns. So yes, maybe you had to pay some tax to the sovereign, but between sovereigns, there was another way of relating. Right? There was Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft. It's very important for people to make this distinction. And to quote Marx, the reason there was mercantilism was because it was a kind of early expression of recognizing the social power of bourgeois society. It's as if bourgeois society manifested in gold. Obviously, gold has always fucking existed, but all of a sudden it seemed to represent a higher form of civilization. Mm-hmm. And so it was being embodied, it was being imbibed with all sorts of, like all the money fetish that, George Knapp goes after in his state theory of money, where he's like, oh, gold has no intrinsic value as money. That's true, but the reason is, why did it seem to be the case with the mercantilists? Because it was a kind of distorted expression of bourgeois society. Adam Smith, of course, already has a critique of metal as the basis of money. Mm-hmm. It's labor. I don't know why anybody fucking thinks, everybody who's listening to this, if you ever say Adam Smith is a barter theory of money, I literally go read his text again. I was going to say something bad, but just, it's fucking wrong. He's saying, no, labor is the real basis of things. Right? It's not about like money. It's like actually that doesn't matter. In fact, Marx even notes that Smith and Ricardo don't really talk about money because it doesn't matter. It's the cooperation of labor for them. So it's like a weird hang-up that people have. So why does it seem to come back that all of a sudden this becomes the basis of things? Because bourgeois society becomes undermined. And thus, to quote Engels, I was just teaching the State and Revolution, the society is the admission, the state is the admission by society that it cannot self-regulate.
Yeah.
So the reason why the state seems to now become the cause of society is because society cannot hold itself together. And yet the condition for the state is the crisis of society. So everything gets tangled up.
Well, the condition for the modern state, there's been state before that.
Yeah, but the state before that was subordinated to bourgeois society.
Right, which is the difference that people know, like Marxists. None of the Marxists I talked to ever made a point of talking about 1848 much or Bonapartism much. We learned about it, like what it was, but like this was never a theme that was developed.
Bonapartism becomes like a style of governing. Like if you're especially, rank, you're a Bonapartist or something. I remember asking somebody, I'm like, would Bernie Sanders be a Bonapartist? And I might as well ask them if I could see naked pictures of them. They were like aghast by my question. But I'm simply saying like the obvious point that like he would run as a capitalist president. It would be all about trying to manage things.
Yeah, we're told today, we learn as Marxists in these sects that it's a bourgeois state, and it's always been a bourgeois state, maybe just in different forms.
Right, and here's even the crazy thing. If I was being particularly like provocative, I would say, I maybe wouldn't say it because it'd be too tricky of a point. It is in a certain way, and that's also the problem, and that's why it's monstrous and deformed.
But like it's a state of the bourgeois class for them and by them, the same as it was before 1848.
Right, right. In other words, because the basis upon which Bonapartism happens is it does make an appeal to liberalism by also violating liberalism. This is what's tricky about it. Meaning, well, how does the emergency powers happen? They go, oh, it's in defense of society,
Right.
right? And so the reason why I said it and then I kind of stepped back is I could obviously make the point that it is a bourgeois state and that's a problem. But I know what people hear by that, and I feel like that would be misleading. Meaning they think, oh, therefore the bourgeois rule or
Yeah.
something, or they've always ruled, or this has always been the same. Whereas really what I'm trying to say is that, and this goes back to your question about MMT programs, the problem with them, so what's the problem with the capitalist state? It doesn't think it's a capitalist state. It's really that simple. Meaning they're like, oh, we're a representative of the people. And you said earlier there's no society, there's like classes.
Yeah.
So okay, what's meant by the classes? It means that the people have become self-contradictory. The classic revolutions in the 18th century were the people united will never be divided. It's literally a people's revolution.
Yeah.
I know you've read the Trotsky, but he has a great way of putting this in Results and Prospects that, he's kind of like, oh, there's two ways to make a revolution. There's a lion pouncing on the state. Right, that's the classic bourgeois revolution. He says the other one is that out of internecine class warfare, one class dominates the other and then fulfills the problems. It's chapter 3 of Results and Prospects from 1906. Okay, so the reason I say that is that when Trotsky says that, he goes, these two ways differ not only tactically, but historically. So the problem, to say, yes, it's a bourgeois state is to say, so the problem is it thinks we still live in a world of the people united will never be divided. And so back to this point about upholding bourgeois property, it's not about upholding the capitalist property. It's that the state is like, there's no contradiction. Right? This is the problem with democracy also, by the way, which is that in the eyes of democracy, we're all children of God. One man, one vote. So in other words, the actual contradiction of democracy doesn't manifest, or it's a fetish form. This is why Das Kapital is a critique of democracy. Because 1848 is basically capitalism is saved on the basis of democracy. So then when I hear MMT, and I think Pavlina Chernava even says, oh, what's great about the job program is it will be a step to democratizing the state. I'm like, yeah, this is the old like fucking Bernstein shit that Rosa Luxemburg just wrecked like over 100 years ago, right? Which is like, no, it's not democratizing the state and that the state is captured by rich people and we just need to make it democratic. It's about the content of why the state is the state qua state. And by the way, what happens in 1848 is the state kills all the capitalists to save capitalism.
Yeah.
It does that again and again. There was a word that was brought up in the discussion. It was called fascism.
Yep.
That was mass democratic killing of people.
Sure.
I'm saying all these things to say, like, obviously democracy from Marxism is like a problem. And it's a question about what is the content of it, right? In other words, that democracy and money and all these things that we've been talking about, they're surface level phenomena. And their content is in their relationship to the whole. So it's like, yeah, money has always existed, but money has not always been the representative of labor value. Here, I'll add another thing to this, which is even more confusing. For Adam Smith, money had become representative of labor. It had become measure of labor value. For Marx, not only is money a representative of labor value, it can also be a representative of capital. Right? Here's another distinction you get with Marx. You get money and capital. And they could be expressed by like, is $100 money? No. Is $101 capital? Maybe. There's like a quantity-quality dialectic here. There's all these things of what's money for you, Eamon, can be capital for somebody else.
Right. Well, what we learned was that money is not, well, sorry, capital is money that reinvested specifically for the purpose of reinvesting in the company and growing
Right. So,
production.
okay. So if you're reinvesting for production, so you've advanced money to some workers. So is that capital to the workers?
No.
No, but it's capital to the capitalists.
Yeah.
Okay, so then at the level of society, it's like, what the fuck is happening? Right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like this, like again, the point is that like the content of these forms, the content is the interrelationship of these forms.
Right.
Right? And when people talk about all these things out of Marxist Capital, they have to read to the end because he's ending volume 3 by saying he's arriving at the content of every single thing he says. He's arriving at the class struggle. We were just saying that's an expression of the self-contradiction of society. Meaning you're arriving at the end of volume 3 and Marx is saying, oh yeah, all this so-called economics I've been talking about, actually it's all ideological. It's an expression of an self-contradictory unconscious society. And that when you look at the interrelationship of these forms, they actually have an identity, but it's a contradictory identity. That bourgeois society is simultaneously the society of labor and the society of capital. And what is capital? Capital is labor, but it's not labor. But it is labor, but it's not labor. Imagine telling somebody this on Capitol Hill at Congress, right? Even you walk in, you go south of the border, you're like, hi, I'm visiting from Canada. I'm here to tell you Yankees. You guys don't know. I'm going to tell you about the wonders of universal healthcare. You guys don't know this crazy shit that's happening. Let me tell you your problem. Your problem is capitalism. And you got up there and you said, okay, so what's capitalism? You're like going to do like this, sectarian thing again. You go, well, capitalism is like when there's capital and labor, and capital is labor, but it's not labor. But it is labor. It's labor time, but it's also not labor. But it's also labor time. They would like remove you from the premises, right? They would just like, they would have no idea what to do with you because it's not something that makes sense in bourgeois rationality. And that's not like a sociological thing. That's not like, are you bourgeois, are you proletarian in a sociological sense?
Yeah.
The only reason why Marx would say the standpoint of the proletariat is because politically they had a kind of drive and impulse or impetus to follow through on the contradiction. It's not that they accepted the contradiction. It's actually that it was their way. It was almost like they were driven to go beyond it.
Yeah.
Whereas Marx is saying, no, it is a contradiction. But if they were to follow through on their logic, they would actually bring out the contradiction. They would grab it with two hands and be able to make something of it. Whereas if you just talk about it at the level of economics, you sound fucking insane. Right? Like, this is why you can never debate on the basis of Marxist economics. It's like, yeah, the labor theory of value, but also this is not true. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I don't know. Push back. Somebody push back. This is why I never go this route.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I'm sure if we got Alex Grant on, you guys could have a vigorous debate on this. But I don't have the energy or the heart, or I don't even really ascribe to that kind of version of things anymore. So I think that's all you're gonna get.
Oh, this is what I would say about because just to put a little meat on what I was just saying, which is that on what basis could Marx simultaneously, I'm going to say, hold the labor theory of value and also treat it as anachronistic and contradictory? Because that's what the proletariat was doing in practice. Mm-hmm. Meaning they were demanding the value of their labor and simultaneously trying to go beyond their class oppression upon being counted as laborers. Right? In other words, they were trying to claim the value of their labor and also go beyond counting labor as value at the same time. If that's clear. Right? They were reacting to being like, oh, it's wage slavery. And yet I want my labor to be counted as a value. And so that became a whole political movement. And so Marx was like, okay, there's something to this. Same with Engels.
Right, like as opposed
Yeah.
to a slave revolt
Yeah.
in previous times, they would never count slavery as a value.
They would never count slavery as a value. And also, what did slaves revolt for? For the value of their labor, right? But it wasn't contradictory. I mean, bourgeois society is a slave revolt,
Yeah.
right? In other words, what is the language that the workers end up using in the 19th century? They say, oh, the capitalist is exploiting me. That's old language. That's the bourgeois revolution is, oh, the Lord is exploiting me. That I didn't get to sell my labor to them. They simply claim by like inherited right, 3 days of my week. Right? It's simply like it's customs that were passed down because I was conquered or my ancestors were conquered. Right? In other words, they revolted to be able to sell themselves, to be exploited by an employer, as opposed to being exploited by like a lord or something like that. So what's happening in the 19th century is there's a recrudescence of the old revolt of the third estate, but under changed conditions.
Right.
So what's crucial for Marx is not that there's a working class, but that there's a proletariat, right? That there's a politically organized working class that, in a sense, is actually almost fighting itself at the political level. Because here's the crazy thing. Ready? Here's for the audience. Who exploits the workers? In the final instance, it is the workers.
The workers.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Right?
I mean, well, they agree to the terms, right? You go into, I mean, technically the capitalists too, but the workers are going into this freely and saying, here's, we signed this contract, we agree to this, I want to have my work exploited.
Well, we don't even have to think at the factory level. The capitalist is just a bearer of society, right? The capitalist is the personification of capital. What's capital? It's socialized property. Right? So in other words, they say it right there in the manifesto, meaning when you're exploited by capital, that is society exploiting you. This is why it wouldn't matter if we were all self-employed. We would just be exploiting ourselves.
Oh yeah, right, exactly. Right? And it's what Rosa Luxemburg argued against co-ops.
Yeah.
Because you haven't changed anything. You're just taking exploitation and implementing it on yourself, for yourself.
Right, exactly. And so, I think also Trotsky in chapter 7 of Results and Prospects says the problem with co-ops is they're premature.
Right.
In other words, for him, the only actual potential of co-ops would be to follow through on the full potential of them, which would be the whole world becoming a co-op. I mean, here's the crazy thing with capitalism. I know you know this, I'm just saying this for the audience, which is that capitalism kind of already is socialism. And we relate to it as if it's not the case. This is the famous phrase in chapter 1 of volume 1 of Capital when Marx says, when people exchange, they do not realize that they're entering into production relations. So I'm going to say this maybe this isn't for the audience, this is for Twitter. This is how retard brain the barista argument is, and it deserves to be called this, which is that when people talk about productive and unproductive labor, they're talking about the Adam Smith argument, meaning the argument from the era of manufacturing. They're repeating it in the era of the Industrial Revolution. So surplus value does not originate from sectors. It's the aggregate laborer. Or here, let me go full into the analogy that people love. So let's say we have the construction worker, the mechanic, like really burly men who are like super productive laborers. Mm-hmm. And then we have like the barista who's just like totally unproductive, totally blue hair.
Who is, by the way, finishing a product.
Oh yeah, there's even that simple point as well,
yeah,
right?
But let's ignore that.
Let's ignore that. Let's just follow on the analogy. Mm-hmm. And they're just sitting there and they're like, my daddy is putting me through art school and I'm totally like still crying about Kamala, like just whatever fucking like archetypes that people put in. Mm-hmm. Okay, who is the productive laborer in that line? I know what people will do is they'll start looking at the vocations of the people in the line and go, well, the construction worker, because he works this amount of time and makes this product or something and this or something like that. No, the productive labor is everybody in the line, including the barista. It's socialized production and bourgeois social relations. It's industrialized production. What people do is they recapitulate the old Smithian argument when manufacturing has been made anachronistic. Meaning the whole point that Marx is just running through, it's not even unique to Marx. It's fucking Robert Owen. It's fucking Andrew Urey. It's anybody who was paying attention during the Industrial Revolution. It's half of the socialists know this shit, is that the entire world is sort of operating in some kind of shaky, because it's kind of unstable unison at once. Meaning, in order for the construction worker to be productive, they need all the capital that's there, or otherwise the value of their labor is completely valueless. And that means all of the materials that go into it, all of the machines, all of the general intellect, all of the social conditions that allow them to be productive, which, by the way, might be the fact that that also means like leisure time. This is why the Frankfurt School can ever have this critique of like TV, because they're saying, isn't this simply an extension of your job? That when you go home, I guess people now are listening to me like ramble about Marxism. The real crazy Marxist critique is this actually part of you like, revitalizing your labor power for another day of work tomorrow?
Sure.
Basically, is like whatever leisure of me rambling is like making you upset or something like that. Maybe hate listening to this.
Well, we're participating in the YouTube economy.
We're participating in the YouTube economy, meaning the whole point is that all the conditions that go into making somebody a productive worker all have a claim on the production of that surplus value.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning it's funny when people start talking about like, oh, who's the productive laborer? They fall back into a bourgeois private property mindset. They're like, no, it's coming from this side of the economy and not that side of the economy. And I'm like, buddy, that's commodity fetishism.
That construction worker got his energy to do his job too on that Starbucks from that barista.
Maybe he was like the blue-haired barista winked at me, and I'm, like I walk around as a construction person. I'm supposed to be into a certain kind of woman, but maybe I'm secretly into this other kind of woman or something like that. No, the whole point is that all of these things are making it possible for all of this to happen, and that's actually why the conditions for socialism are there, because surplus labor is the wealth of society in Adam Smith's time. That's made anachronistic. Meaning the problem is not that we exploit labor. The problem is that exploiting labor is an inadequate basis to capture the potential of industrial society.
Right.
Right?
The potential of society is there. Socialism is sitting there. We just don't have the means to grab it and do it.
Right. And because to grab it and do it actually requires a subject that can operate it. I mean, and it's not that like I can just put Karl Marx in the White House. The subject actually has to be a social subject. It has to be, in a sense, the aggregate labor, as I was just trying to describe, operating as a subject. To quote Max Horkheimer, what is the rational subject? Socialism. Like literally socialism is the construction of a subject that can even tarry with the problem in the first place. So here's another thing the sects do. They talk about socialism as solving these problems. No, socialism will allow us to even engage with them on a basis in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like the only fucking reason you would ever say support the socialists will get you healthcare or something, it would simply be that you were trying to expose how politically compromised the present rulers are because you're about to take power. Like, think about the phrases that the Bolsheviks said in October of 1917. Land, peace, and bread.
What was it?
Land, bread, peace.
Yeah,
peace, land, and bread. Right, these kind of things like this. All of them could be done by a capitalist government, and in a sense, were likely to eventually happen.
Mm-hmm.
There would be an end to the war. They weren't going to have this fucking grain monopoly forever because the peasants weren't going to allow it. right? And the land, like, it's in the interest of capitalism to redistribute the land from the black hundreds. Like, what the fuck? That's not stable to have a bunch of weird, like, leftover orthodox, like,
Semi-feudal, yeah.
of course not, right? So it was going to happen anyways, in a sense, and Woodrow Wilson would have supported it. So it's one of these questions that, it's like the famous Bolsheviks were supporting the, like, oh, we'll actually bring you the National Assembly. I bring this up because, of course, they dismissed the National Assembly. And then this drives people insane. Oh, Lenin, why could you ever do this thing? The point of saying we could actually realize these things is because politically we have the means to actually carry them out. But you don't need socialism for that, right? And the only reason you would even be able to carry out these bourgeois reforms is precisely because you're going beyond them, right? In other words, we can realize a national assembly because actually that's not even the goal. The goal eventually would be to overcome the need for a national assembly in the first place. So like something like universal healthcare, it's like, if socialists fight for that today, they're not about to take power. So you're not actually exposing the political compromise of any capitalist politician. You're just supporting some capitalist politician.
Right.
And then when they don't deliver it, you're like, oh, well, this is why you need a socialist. And I'm like, you haven't proved that even fucking remotely, right? You're just, sour graping that they didn't listen to you or something because they don't need your vote. It would simply be a case where it'd be like, yeah, we can do this because we know that universal healthcare is just a capitalist reform. And it could be done on a totally conservative basis. Like, yeah, it could, of course. It could be efficient. It could be totally shit in the US. It could be like, yeah, we got universal healthcare. It's what Amy Finkelstein talks about in her book. It's like, yeah, you got universal healthcare and it's just like a flat camp mattress that you get to like sit on, or something. And yeah, like in other words, you could get these things and it could be new problems and stuff. The point is not really the reforms. The point is the process at getting them, how you would be creating a subject that can reflect on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's actually no, that's probably a pretty good place to end unless you have any other thoughts.
No, I was going to say tariffs and stuff, but we can end if you want.
Tariffs. Ooh, tariffs is okay. Maybe a quick thing on tariffs.
Sure. So two things on tariffs, and because it'll be related to the socialized production. I'll be able to make a case about this. Because I know you were going to be like, what is my thought on trade deficits?
Right. Well, yeah. Okay. Let me just expand here. Lenin, like all the Stalinists who talk about Lenin, and the Trotskyists actually will say that the reason for capitalism, the reason for imperialism is export capital. Capitalists need to they run out of markets internally. They need to export their capital externally, and that's how you keep profitability going. You keep up GDP. But MMT is saying, well, actually, you want a trade deficit because that brings more wealth into your country, and it's only monies you're sending abroad. But while you get to hoard more of dead labor and commodities and wealth or whatever.
Okay, so here's my response, ready? And it's related to what I just said. Both of them are commodity fetishism. Okay, why? So again, here I've taught the Lenin's imperialism pamphlet for about 10 years, so this is usually what I say. On the one hand, you never export capital. Capital's not a thing. Right? Like this is a thing that all the sects say, but I don't know if they ever like follow through on what they're saying. Like capital's not a thing. You can't export it or something like that.
Machines.
So machines are not capital.
Factories and machines is what they would say.
Factory and machines are not capital. Right?
They're constant capital.
They're not even capital's not a thing. It's a social relation.
It's a social relation.
Marx makes fun of this in his letter on Proudhon. After Proudhon dies, he goes, "Oh, Proudhon used to think like capital means machines." Right? And it's like, okay, contraptions have always existed. They had steam engines in ancient Greece. They weren't capital. So again, it goes back to this thing about what is capital. That's why Marx wrote this entire book on it. So what's really happening in terms of the export of capital is simply that the social power that puts it in motion is being moved around, right? It's private property. That's what people are seeing move.
Mm-hmm.
but production is socialized.
Hmm.
Okay, so what's really being expressed in trade deficits and trade surpluses is the accounting identity, like GDP, and so this also gets expressed in the current and capital account.
Hmm.
Those are bourgeois forms. They're on
Hmm.
the basis of labor on private property. And the permanent deficit and permanent surpluses that we get, or let me say persistent deficits and surpluses, they're expressing the socialization of production, right? So you can think about, I don't know, Trump is right now tariffing your country, or maybe every
Yes.
country, so like who knows?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's kind of like, is he tariffing Canada or is he tariffing American businesses?
He's tariffing American businesses.
Right.
In
Why?
effect,
Why?
be,
Because, they get nylon from Canada and then they send it down to Mexico to be sewed there. And then it gets sent back and dyed in Canada and then it gets sent back down into Mexico to create cars that are then rolled off and shipped across the border to the US. Right? That's a classic example. I can
yeah,
do a semiconductor example as well. Production's fucking socialized.
yeah,
So it's being refracted through bourgeois forms and it's looking like a permanent trade surplus or a permanent trade deficit.
hmm,
And then those deficits and surpluses get politicized to explain the crisis of society,
yeah,
right? In other words, I was just listening to Unhedged, the Financial Times podcast today, and they were like making fun of Trump, but I thought there was a point to this where they were saying, well, Trump links the trade deficit to fentanyl abuse in the United States. And I really wanted to say to the Financial Times people, because they were making fun of it, I'm like, but that's also his political genius. That's actually brilliance.
well, I mean,
Because
that's
it,
how legally he can. That's his way to get around the rules.
Well, yes, yes. I see what you're saying in terms of why he tariffs things and does all these. Is that what you meant?
But no, he needs a national security
Oh, right, right.
justification to do this.
I meant at an even higher level. I just
Oh,
meant at the
sure.
level of narrative, meaning he has like a political economy.
Hmm.
This is something I'm going to say at the Labor Forum on Saturday. I'm going to be like, yeah, we can be totally against everything Trump is doing, but he has a political economy. Meaning they politicize the economy. They'll say, oh, this might cost us, but it will be better in the long run. Meaning they have this
Yeah,
idea of this question about restructuring the economy, everything. Okay. So the reason I say this is that the tariffs are obviously a capitalist way of kind of confusingly trying to change the organization of the socialization of production.
yeah,
Because it's like if we tariff these places, we feel like we can compel these companies to come back into the US or these companies to go over there or these companies to shift around here. Like, in other words, the tariffing of China in 2018 and 2019, who was the biggest beneficiary? Vietnam and like
yeah,
Mexico.
yeah,
And maybe, who knows, maybe the US is like, we'd rather fuck with Vietnam than China because Vietnam is kind of, what is it, the three no's? Like, they're like, yeah, we're not getting involved in shit and we can work with the US or something. Whatever the US national security strategy, they might be like, we can deal with them better. But now Trump is unleashing tariffs on everybody. Why is he unleashing tariffs on everybody? Because there are all of these holes in the USMCA, I'm sure people know this, such that you can you they thought they could put things in a certain way that you could claim preferred like preferential treatment in a certain way and get a lower tariff if you had like a rule of origination of I think it was like 62.5%,
hmm,
or it might have been more than that, something like that, whatever the number is. But companies found it cheaper to not follow the rule and simply take the most favored nation's tariff from the US and bring in their products in a different way and go through different avenues like China building in Mexico
hmm,
and things like this. So the tariffs, what I'm trying to say is, yes, if we want to feel smart and be like, this is a retard move, fine, it's a retard move. The point is, what it is it's capitalist politics trying to deal with the socialization of production.
hmm, yeah,
And so for me, it's like, I have neither. It's not about trade surpluses being good or trade deficits being good. Because if you're saying I'm benefiting from a trade deficit, then it's like, are you saying I'm just fucking over China? I'm also against that. The Chinese workers are my friends.
hmm,
Why not?
Right.
I don't want to be like, oh yeah, I'm like leeching off of them. And likewise with the trade surplus, it's like, obviously I think Chinese workers are underpaid.
Hmm.
And likewise, my third point is, in a sense, trade deficits and trade surpluses are misrecognitions of society, of the socialization of production. And nobody ever talks about that then. Meaning, a lot of the US trade deficit is just US national corporations, like multinational corporations, that are just like going abroad and then exporting back into the US through Ireland or through Costa Rica.
Right.
Or right. And so like I think Fatih Guvnin, he's an economist, I think up at MIT, maybe. He has a great like MBR article where he's like, the four biggest economies in the world are the United States, the European Union, China, and you ready for this, Eamon? US multinational corporations
As one block.
as one, right? So not even the US economy, US multinational corporations. So whenever you hear people say, oh, we don't produce things anymore, it's like, no, the US corporations have got really good at making it so it looks like they don't produce anything because they're saying, no, it was Ireland that did it, or it was the UK that did it, or it was Vietnam that did it, or it was the Netherlands that did it, or it was Costa Rica that did it.
Where do BlackRock and Vanguard and those guys fit in?
I mean, what we're talking about there is we're talking about capital management, right? Asset management.
Yeah.
And I know people like to try to do this thing where they're like, with Lenin, he talks about the big banks and
Yep.
okay, this kind of thing. The reason those companies are so big is because they just have gigantic funds that just replicate the stock market. And there's an economies of scale aspect to it because there isn't a proportional increase in costs from going from 100 billion to 500 billion to $1 trillion in assets under management.
Hmm.
I mean, I know the reason why a lot of people have whatever rancor towards them is that they feel like they have pushed some kind of ESG thing on people. This is the Vivek Ramaswamy thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's some of what gets talked about. Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think it ends up being kind of like you're going to hate what I'm about to say, but almost like hysterical. Like the Frankfurt School would say anti-Semitism, but they don't mean against Jews. They mean anti-finance and anti-merchant,
Oh,
like
100%.
anti-market stuff. My point is that actually, it's not that they, like people here, they own everything, but what they're doing is they're simply replicating the index. And so they're owning things, but really it's that people who own their funds, who are anyone who has a retirement account, is also owning that. Meaning they could be the condition for future socialism.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So,
Sorry. That gets me to the other thing I wanted
yeah.
to finish off was, yeah, the banks, the BlackRock, the Vanguard. That's all like Walmart and Amazon are all going to be part of socialism, or at least the dictatorship of the proletariat. One of the arguments people make in the chat, or sorry, in the comments, was that MMT, and I've heard this elsewhere, MMT is actually one of the things that we are going to, as socialists, once we have created the dictatorship of the proletariat, once we've taken over, we're going to be implementing MMT ourselves to manage society in the early stages.
Right. I don't know what that means, I guess, maybe. But to me, like just for the audience, socialism doesn't like solve anything. It only begins that we can even tarry with the problem. There's even a famous passage from Lenin where he says, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not the end of the class struggle. It's actually the beginning of it. And by the way, Trotsky says the same thing in Results and Prospects, right? That socialism is actually the beginning of the whole thing. It's the beginning of the revolution. So in terms of, are we going to be handling, like, are we going to be carrying out MMT? I guess, but to me, the more important point is, are you actually going to be advancing the contradiction? And to say advancing the contradiction, people hear that as worseism. No, are you actually going to be advancing the engagement with the problem? Mm-hmm. Are you going to be giving form to it? So, like, I guess people I don't know, would the dictatorship of the proletariat just give a job guarantee to people? Yes, but why would it do so? Not because, okay, now we're living in a nice society, but because you're trying to stop the scabs from creating the counter-revolution,
Right.
right? And does that mean that the problem of the overproduction of labor power goes away? No. In fact, you're trying to pay off the scabs so that you can even tarry with the problem in the first place. Because then the workers, to quote Rosa Luxemburg, have to fight with their enemy in every factory. This is great language she has. In every factory, the worker will be fighting with their enemy eye to eye, face to face. And it's like, wait, who is their enemy? Eamon, I'm setting you up to end the podcast. Who is the worker's enemy?
Themselves.
There you go. Right? So in other words, whenever the workers are like, oh, we're going to advance the factory production, they're like, oh, are we going to be maybe creating unemployed people? What are we going to do with them? How is that going to be organized in the local, I don't know where you live in Canada, but Soviet or whatever it can be called. It can be called council. It doesn't have to be called Soviet. Right? So are we going to be doing MMT? It's like, are people going to be breathing oxygen? I guess. Yeah, sure. Yes. I don't know. It's like not, it's kind of, I feel like a lot of the MMT people have to actually take Marx more seriously. I'm sorry. Because when I see the kind of quick, blithe dismissal, it just, I don't know. Maybe not Bill Mitchell, but some of the people in the comments were like, oh, have you the labor theory of value? And I'm like, yeah, that's not what they believe.
All right.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much.
This is it's been good. We've solved socialism. We've solved MMT. Thanks, everybody. We're gonna end the stream now.
Cool.